Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something medieval, something messy, and something that'll make you extra thankful for your modern plumbing, coffee, and basic bodily autonomy. We're heading back to the Middle Ages to walk in the shoes, probably muddy and poorly cobbled, of a young girl growing up in a world where sex, virtue, and your place in the world were all pre-scripted before you even took your first breath. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and the current time in the comments, just so we can all feel connected, like a cozy little time-travelling book club. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, imagine you're born in the year 1287, somewhere in rural England. You're a girl, congrats. That means your future has already been neatly outlined like a very grim recipe. Add one early betrothal, stir in some parental control, spice with strict church teachings, and bake under a constant fire of moral scrutiny. From the second you squall into the world, everyone around you sees not you, but what you'll represent. To your father, you're a potential alliance. To your mother, a cautionary tale waiting to unfold. To your neighbours, a virtue to be defended. And to the church, a walking temptation that must be shackled in guilt and silence. There is no coming of age, there's only coming into usefulness. Your earliest memories might be laced with lullabies, but quickly they give way to commands. Sit up straight, don't run, speak softly, cover yourself, and oh, don't be vain, or too pretty, or too bold, or too quiet, because that could also mean you're sneaky. It's like trying to play a game where the rules are hidden and the board keeps shifting, except your reputation is the prize, and you only get one shot. By the age of 6, you've already noticed that your brothers are treated differently. They can wander a little. They can question things. You learn obedience like it's a second language. You help your mother, you avoid idleness, a big medieval sin for girls, and you already understand that curiosity can be dangerous. If you ask too much about your own body, how it works, what it means, you'll be met with silence, or worse, superstition. Here's a fun historical fact to curl up with. Many medieval people believed the womb could wander around your body if you didn't manage your humours correctly. Yup, your uterus was apparently a rogue organ just cruising through your internal highway like a lost tourist. And still, your parents probably love you in their own way. It's just that love, in this era, is filtered through the lens of duty. Preparing you for marriage isn't cruel, it's expected. The idea that you might one day choose whom you love or when to marry is about as realistic as flying to the moon, which ironically some people back then believed was actually a glowing orb full of heavenly fire. Around the age of 10 or 11 the whispers begin, not just about your first bleeding, though that'll come soon enough, but about your value. Marriage negotiations could start now, especially if your family has connections. You're not even old enough to have your own thoughts fully formed, and already you're being discussed like a chess piece. She'd make a good match for Lord So-and-so, they might say. She's quiet and strong, comes from good stock. Not unlike talking about livestock, honestly. One scholarly debate that still buzzes today, whether young girls in medieval Europe actually accepted this future as normal, or if they dreamed, secretly, of something more. Of freedom. Of not being married off to a man 3 times their age with gout, and a castle that smells like boiled cabbage. We can't know for sure, because most of those girls never wrote diaries, but I think we both know how the human spirit works. Somewhere, someone looked up at the stars over a smoky village and thought, there must be more than this. Meanwhile, your day-to-day life is a mix of chores and silent observation. You learn to keep your head down. You're taught basic prayers and maybe, if your family can afford it, how to spin or sew. Education? Reserved for boys or nuns. But you're not headed to a convent unless you're rich, extra pious, or someone's trying to offload you without a dowry. By the time your body starts changing, no one talks about it openly. You're just given vague warnings. Guard your virtue. Don't be alone with men. The devil loves a girl who doesn't know her place. Great. Very helpful. There's no talk of hormones or consent or pleasure. Sex is whispered about only in the context of sin or marriage, and sometimes both. And here's the twisted thing. It's not just your body they want to control. It's your entire existence, your voice, your laughter, your gaze. If you're too cheerful, you might be trying to seduce someone. Too quiet, maybe you're scheming. There's no safe default mode. And the paranoia isn't just from your parents, it's baked into the culture. Everything about your identity is framed by the word chaste. It becomes the glass you're viewed through. If you smile at the wrong time, if your dress is too bright, if someone spreads a rumour, your worth is gone, just like that. And there's no repair manual. Once your purity is questioned, society doesn't bother with second chances. And no, you can't explain yourself. Girls don't have that kind of voice. Not in court, not in church, not in family matters. You are there to be seen, but not heard, to be useful, but not powerful, and to endure, but never complain. You might start to feel like you exist in the margins, a footnote in a story written by someone else. But maybe, on a quiet night when no one's watching, you dream. You imagine running through the woods barefoot, unbothered. You dream of kissing someone because you want to, not because you're told to. You think about what it would feel like to laugh without consequence, and even though you'd never say it out loud, maybe you even imagine a world where being a girl isn't a problem to solve, but a life to live. So here you are, maybe 12 years old, maybe 13 if you're lucky and your parents are patient. But even that might be pushing it. The whispers have turned into murmurs, and now actual conversations are happening about your future. Not your career aspirations, don't be silly, but your marriage prospects. And yes, it's entirely normal for girls your age to be married off to men who have grandchildren. Because welcome to the medieval marriage market, where virginity is currency, and your value peaks before you even finish growing. You're not just a daughter anymore, you're a deal, a negotiation in a tunic. The conversations usually happen without you. Your father sits with another man, maybe a neighbour, maybe a noble, and talks about land, livestock, alliances and dowries. You're discussed somewhere between a prized cow and a plot of wheat. She's healthy, they say. She's obedient. Sometimes, if they're really trying to sweeten the pot, they'll mention your dowry like it's a bonus feature on a used cart. She'll come with 10 sheep and a spinning wheel, or maybe a bit of land if your family's lucky. What's a dowry exactly? Ah, yes. It's the lovely tradition of a girl's family giving money or goods to her husband's family so that he'll take her off their hands. Romantic, right? It's like paying someone to babysit your child forever, but the babysitter also owns your child afterward, and the amount of your dowry can determine everything: who you marry, how well you're treated, and whether your husband's family even wants you alive after a while. If your dowry's good, great, you're an asset. If it's bad, you might be seen as a burden, or worse, expendable. And here's the kicker. If you die in childbirth, which happens a lot, they keep the dowry. No refunds, one less mouth to feed and a tidy profit. Grim? Absolutely. But that's the economic reality of the medieval romance system. The noble families treated it like a high-stakes investment strategy. Peasant families saw it as survival. Either way, love had very little to do with anything. Now, you're probably wondering, did the girls actually want to get married at that age? Some might have. Others probably cried through their wedding nights. Most were told it was their duty, just as they were told not to question the church or disobey their fathers. And it's hard to know exactly what they thought, because again, barely any of them got to leave behind letters or journals. The written word wasn't meant for girls like you, but even so, picture yourself standing in a smoky little church, your hair braided down your back, wearing your best tunic, which is still scratchy and slightly too short. You're next to a man at least twice your age. He might have grey in his beard, he might smell like horses, he might look like he's already planning your schedule, meals, children, obedience. You don't hold hands, there's no kissing, the priest is there, a Latin chant rolling off his tongue that you don't understand, and at some point it's done. You're married. The wedding feast is more for the families than for you. You might sit quietly while everyone drinks and laughs and toasts the match. You're expected to be shy, to blush if anyone makes a crude joke, to look down and not make eye contact with your new husband unless he speaks to you directly. Meanwhile, the actual terrifying part is still ahead. The bedding ceremony. Oh yes, it's not enough that you're young and terrified. In many noble families, people literally watch the consummation of the marriage. Not from inside the room, but from just outside, with cheering and encouragement and the occasional peeking involved. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some regions, the newlyweds were walked to the bed by friends and family who then proceeded to throw their stockings at them. Whoever's sock landed on the bride or groom was believed to be the next to marry. Like an awkward, foot-scented version of tossing the bouquet. But this moment is not cute for you. You're a child, and tonight you're expected to become a woman. There is no maybe later, no waiting until you're ready. That concept doesn't exist here. If your husband decides to take what he's owed, because yes, the marriage is considered a legal claim to your body, you must submit. Consent isn't just ignored, it's not even part of the vocabulary. You are the wife. He is the head. That's the order of things. Some scholars debate whether medieval girls ever tried to resist these arrangements, and it's an open question. There are stories, fragments, of girls who ran away, of marriages that were never consummated, of secret romances that defied expectation. But the punishment for rebellion was steep. Disobedience could get you beaten, disowned, or thrown into a convent to live out your days in silence. And in some cases it could even lead to execution, especially if you embarrassed a powerful family. You don't really own yourself anymore. You can't say no, you can't run, and you definitely can't tell anyone if the wedding night was traumatic. In fact, you're expected to smile through it. You'll be asked to display the bloody sheets in the morning to prove your virginity. Some women faked it, poking their fingers to produce blood, or using animal blood. But if you couldn't produce that proof, scandal, immediate scandal. And if you're thinking this all sounds like some bizarre, cruel performance art, you're not wrong. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was spectacle. You were expected to protect it like treasure, but then surrender it in a socially approved public ritual. And if you somehow lost it beforehand, even by force, your chances of marriage dropped like a stone into a dark well. The irony, of course, is that this whole system was supposed to be about piety and honour, yet it was built on shame, fear, and relentless control. Your value came from your body, but only if it was untouched. You had no power, but were blamed for men's temptation, and the more obedient you were, the better off everyone said you'd be. So you keep your head down, you serve your new household, you prepare for pregnancy, even if your hips haven't fully formed. You're told to pray and to be grateful, because your husband could have been worse. And maybe he could have. Maybe he doesn't beat you. Maybe he doesn't sneer at your every move. Maybe he even lets you visit your family once a year. That's a win in this world. A quiet, awful win. But somewhere inside, a small voice begins to form. A question. It's not loud yet, and you'll probably never say it aloud. But it lingers. Why me? You don't remember exactly when you started thinking of yourself as a transaction, but now that the wedding's over and your role has changed from daughter to wife, it's clear. You're no longer a girl in her father's home. You're a commodity that's been traded, sealed and delivered. And now the real work begins. Marriage isn't a soft bed of roses. It's housework, hard labour, and if you're noble, a crushing parade of etiquette and endless soul-numbing small talk with people who think you're too young to even hold a conversation. Let's talk about dowries again for a second. The reason your new family might even pretend to tolerate you is because of what you brought into the marriage. Your sheep, your coin, your plot of land, or even just your family name. Dowries were more than just generous gifts. They were often mandatory for sealing a marriage agreement. And for girls with nothing to offer, well, they were sometimes sent to convents, sold off as labourers, or married to much older widowers who just needed a housekeeper who could birth children. And that's the fun twist here. Your marriage isn't actually considered legitimate until you consummate it, which means the pressure to produce heirs isn't just about continuing your husband's family line. It's about legal and social recognition. No sex, no marriage. In fact, medieval courts sometimes annulled marriages on the grounds of non-consummation. That's right, your private, traumatic experience is also a legal matter now. Romantic, huh? But let's not get too deep into that yet, because right now you're probably still reeling from your first night. Maybe he was gentle, maybe not. Either way, no one asked how you felt about it, because feelings don't factor in. You've heard other girls whisper about their first nights, speaking in metaphors, half-truths and superstition. Don't bleed too much or you'll die. Don't look at him in the eye or he won't finish. If he doesn't like you, he'll find someone who costs less. No one explains what sex actually is, not in any real helpful way. You're expected to just figure it out, survive it. You're told to lie still, to let it happen, to pray. Sex for girls isn't about connection or discovery. It's not even about procreation as much as it is about control. And in the church's view, it's a necessary sin. Yep, you heard that right. Sex inside marriage was only tolerated because it was a way to make babies. Enjoying it too much, even as a wife, was considered morally suspect. The church said women's bodies were vessels of sin, that Eve had tempted Adam, and every woman since had carried that curse. You've been raised to believe your body can cause ruin. So, if you enjoy sex, that's suspicious. If you hate it, that's expected. There is no winning. And if you ever dare to speak up, if you tell another woman that your husband hurts you, that you're afraid, that you feel like something is deeply wrong, there's a good chance she'll tell you to pray harder. Or worse, remind you that it's your duty, that God tests us all. It's like trying to scream underwater. No one hears you. Or they do, but they just keep walking. Here's a weird little historical fact to toss in with all this darkness. Some medieval belief systems thought that a woman couldn't get pregnant unless she orgasmed. So in rape trials, rare as those were, if a girl ended up pregnant, it was considered evidence that she must have enjoyed it. Therefore, it wasn't rape. That's the kind of logic we're dealing with. As the weeks pass, you start to understand the rhythms of your new life. You wake early, tend to the hearth, feed the animals or oversee the servants if you're noble, and you do what's expected. Your husband might leave for hunting or meetings or war. He's busy, you're not. And even though you're technically the lady of the house now, you don't get to make real decisions. You might have a say in how much bread to bake, or which herbs to dry, but the important things, land, money, your own body, all outside your control. So let's say you're lucky enough to not get pregnant right away. That might buy you a little time, or maybe not. Because now the midwife is watching you. The servants are whispering. Your mother-in-law, yes, she lives with you, is asking questions. In this world, your womb isn't private, it's public interest. If a year passes and you haven't conceived, people start talking, and not quietly. Some might blame you. Others might blame the humours. There were 1,000 theories about fertility, many of them wrong. Cold air, sinful thoughts, sleeping on the wrong side. But almost no one considered that maybe your husband's aging, lopsided reproductive system might be the issue. Nah, that'd be too easy. But back to you. Maybe you're around 14 now, still a teenager, still growing, and if you're pregnant, congratulations, you now get to experience childbirth in the medieval era, a terrifying blood-soaked gauntlet of pain, prayer, and blind hope. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. For now, just know this. Even though you're officially a wife, you're not free. The idea of independence is a fantasy. You don't own your own home, you don't own your own thoughts, and as you settle into this new identity, you begin to understand what generations of girls before you already knew. This isn't a partnership, it's a performance, one you'll be judged for every day, even in silence. It's worth noting that some girls found ways to cope. Small rebellions, private joys. Maybe it was a secret garden. Maybe it was poetry. Maybe it was an understanding maid or an older woman who slipped you advice wrapped in metaphors. But those were rare and quiet things, not revolutionary. You learned to take what you could get, and so you adapt. Not because you want to, but because you must. Because the cost of resistance is too high, and the rewards of submission, while hollow, are at least safe. For now. And still, that same question, whispered and dangerous, returns at night when your husband snores beside you, and the wind howls through the shutters. What if this wasn't the life I was meant for? Time passes in strange ways now. You've begun to lose track of your age. 14, 15. You know your body's changing because everyone around you keeps pointing it out. Not with praise, but with clinical eyes and muttered concerns. Your hips are being watched, your belly, your breasts, all indicators of one thing, fertility. That one word hangs over your head like a candle about to gutter out. You either fulfill the role, or you fail, and failure in your case is dangerous. This brings us to the grim math of medieval womanhood. Your survival, your standing, even your continued presence in your husband's home, it all depends on what you bring forth. Not your personality, not your talents, just healthy, preferably male children. Your dowry may have brought you into the marriage, but it's your womb that keeps you there. And if it doesn't cooperate, well, let's talk about that. Infertility in the Middle Ages was a taboo that wasn't blamed equally. You, as the woman, bore most of it. If months, then years, passed without a pregnancy, people wouldn't wonder if your husband had bad seed. No, they'd start watching you for signs of sin. Maybe you were vain. Maybe you laughed too loud. Maybe you didn't pray enough. Or worse, maybe you secretly didn't want children, and that alone could curse your womb, according to the clergy. Even your dreams weren't safe. Some believed that a woman who dreamed too vividly or too lustfully could heat the blood and upset the sacred balance required to conceive. If that sounds like medical nonsense, that's because it was. But that didn't stop people from prescribing treatments, like making you drink potions of wine, dried herbs, and, wait for it, crushed earthworms, or tying a dried rabbit's foot to your undergarments. Medicine and magic were often the same thing here. Science? That's centuries away. Now let's say you do become pregnant. At first, there's celebration, cautious but loud. You're congratulated. You're fussed over. Your mother-in-law might even show a sliver of kindness. For a moment, you feel hope. You imagine a baby in your arms, maybe even a girl like you, but one you'll protect if you're allowed to raise her. You think maybe this is what all of this pain was leading to. Then the fear sets in, because you know what happens next. You've heard the stories whispered between women, behind garden walls and in the backs of kitchens. The screams from the birthing room, the quiet that follows. Death during childbirth isn't rare, it's expected. There's no anesthesia, no clean tools, no surgeons with fancy degrees. There's a midwife, maybe a helper or two, and a lot of praying. That's it. And if something goes wrong, if the baby won't come out, or comes out the wrong way, or arrives without breath, the first instinct isn't necessarily to help you, it's to save the baby. A midwife might press on your belly with all her weight. They might use tools you've never seen before, rusty, terrifying things, to force the child free. Sometimes they perform something called a craniotomy, where a dead baby's skull is collapsed to remove it from the womb. All of this while you're screaming, and bleeding, and maybe dying. And here's your historical fact. During the late Middle Ages, it was common for women to write, or have a priest write, a last will and testament when they went into labour, just in case. That's how dangerous childbirth was. It was like stepping onto a battlefield every time, and unlike soldiers, you had no choice. But if you survive, and the baby does too, you still don't get to rest. You're expected to breastfeed, to recover silently, to get back to your duties as soon as possible. Your body, still aching, still raw, is treated like a machine that should be ready to function immediately. And if the baby dies days later or weeks later, there is no grief counselling. There is only silence, or worse, blame. Maybe you held the baby wrong. Maybe you offended God. Maybe you're cursed. The church has its say in all of this too. They decide how soon your child is baptized, how soon you can resume marital duties, and whether or not your labour pains were divine punishment for Eve's original sin. No joke. That's what they taught, that women must suffer in childbirth because of what Eve did in the garden. So every contraction is a holy consequence. Neat. Still, amid all this horror, you might find strange moments of connection. Maybe your midwife tells you a joke that makes you laugh even through the pain. Maybe a servant sneaks you honey when you're too weak to eat. Maybe your mother-in-law, shockingly, sits by your bed and hums an old lullaby from her youth. These small things, they're survival too. Women helping women, in hushed rebellion against a system that only values them as vessels. But not everyone wants you to survive. Here's where things get darker. If your dowry was small, if your husband's family wanted to make another marriage alliance, or if you failed to produce a son, your safety could quietly vanish. Some women were poisoned, others simply fell ill and never recovered. No autopsy, no justice. A new wife would appear in your place, and life would roll on like nothing happened. There's a real, ongoing scholarly debate about how common this was. Intentional harm or neglect aimed at inconvenient wives. But the fear was real. You felt it in the way people stopped meeting your gaze, in how the healer stopped coming, in how your meals started tasting just a little strange. So you stay quiet, you stay useful, you survive. That's the only word that matters now. And through all of this, what no one tells you is that your body is aging faster than it should. Girls who gave birth too young often faced complications later in life. Chronic pain, incontinence, infertility. But you're still expected to be beautiful, submissive and healthy. A living contradiction wrapped in a too tight bodice. But maybe one night, when the house is asleep and the fire is low, you sit by the window and think about your old village. The one with the stream, the trees, the crooked little hill where you used to pick wildflowers. You close your eyes and remember the feeling of grass between your toes. For a moment, you're a girl again. Just a girl. Then your baby stirs in the cradle and reality returns. You rise gently to quiet them, and as you hum a tune that your mother once sang, you whisper again, almost silently, "There has to be more than this." The church bells chime in the distance, their dull echo bouncing through the stone halls of your new life. You're holding the baby now, your first, or maybe your second, and you feel like a stranger in your own skin. The labour left you with aches that haven't gone away, a body stitched and torn in ways you don't fully understand. But you're here, alive, and that counts as a win, doesn't it? At least, that's what the midwife said as she wiped your brow and whispered, "You're lucky." You didn't feel lucky. You felt like you'd been cracked open and pieced back together without a manual. But you had something many girls never did, a surviving child, and that means you can still fulfill your purpose. It keeps you safe for now. Of course, not all girls were destined to be wives. Some were sent to convents, some willingly, most not. If your family couldn't afford a dowry, or if they had too many daughters and not enough land, you might have ended up behind stone walls wearing a habit before you even knew how to read the Psalms. But don't go picturing a peaceful monastery garden with singing nuns and birds chirping in harmony. Life in a convent could be just as confining, just as political, and yes, just as controlling when it came to your body. Because the church didn't give you an out. Whether you were married or cloistered, your sexuality was still under surveillance. In fact, nuns were expected to embody perfect purity, which meant not just abstaining from sex, but from desire itself. Thinking a lustful thought, that was a sin. Dreaming about someone, a sin. Smiling too long at a male messenger, a sin and probably a disciplinary meeting. And if you were caught, well, let's just say punishments range from public penance to being locked in a cell with only bread and water for days. And yet, the irony, some noble families preferred to send daughters to convents not for holiness, but convenience. It kept girls from marrying beneath them, removed potential scandals, and, here's the fun bit, let them avoid paying another dowry. Some even use convents as a backup plan. Let's see if we can marry her off. If not, we'll dump her at St. Margaret's. For many girls, the cloister wasn't a choice, it was exile. Still, some women did find a strange sense of autonomy there. Away from the expectations of marriage and childbearing, some nuns rose to power within the church structure. Abbesses controlled large lands, managed finances, even advised male clergy. They wrote letters, oversaw libraries, and occasionally slipped their thoughts into historical records. So while the convent could be a prison, for a lucky and rare few, it became a place to think freely, if only within carefully guarded walls. Now, let's shift the lens to the darker edge of all this. The uncomfortable truth that even behind those walls, sexual violence still existed. Priests and bishops were not immune to temptation or power abuse. Scandals happened, pregnancies occurred, and when they did, who got punished? The girls, of course. A nun found with child was accused of being seduced by the devil, or worse, of willingly consorting with evil. The priest might be moved quietly to another post. The girl, she might be expelled, or locked up, or worse. It's easy to romanticize the convent life as a quiet retreat from the chaos of the world. But even there, your identity as a girl was defined by what you denied yourself. There was no space where your body simply belonged to you. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some monasteries believed that talking too much could lead to impure thoughts. So some girls were punished for gossiping by being forced to wear a wooden scold's bridle, a nasty muzzle with a flat piece that pressed down on the tongue. Medieval chastity wasn't just about your actions. It was about your mouth, your gaze, even your thoughts. And here's the heart of it. No matter where you ended up, married or cloistered, you were under watch. The idea of freedom, of choosing who to love or when or if, was basically a myth. You could pray, you could obey, you could survive. But autonomy? That didn't come with the linen veil or the marriage ring, it just wasn't part of the vocabulary. And yet, rebellion simmered, in whispers, in scribbled letters, in forbidden books passed from one hand to another. Some nuns wrote poetry that hinted at longing. Some wives took lovers, carefully, secretly. Some girls ran away from forced betrothals, hiding under false names or dressing as boys to find work in cities where no one knew them. These were the outliers. The risks were enormous, but they existed. There's an open scholarly debate about how common female resistance really was in medieval times. Some argue it was rare, too dangerous. Others believe it was more widespread than we know, just never recorded. After all, who was writing the history books? Mostly men, and men didn't tend to preserve the stories of rebellious girls. That didn't fit the narrative. But maybe once in a while a story leaked through, like the one of the nun who escaped her convent and lived with a band of travelling performers, or the girl who faked madness to avoid a noble marriage, or the midwife who secretly ran a refuge for pregnant girls. These were the shadows of women refusing the roles handed to them. As for you, you probably wouldn't have known any of these stories. Your world is too small, your walls too thick. But perhaps you sense the resistance in your own quiet way. Maybe in how you teach your daughter to read, even though it's discouraged. Maybe in the way you make up bedtime stories that end with girls saving themselves, not waiting for rescue. Maybe it's just in how you walk with your head a little higher than they taught you to. The rules are still there, the expectations, the silence. But there's something else now too, a flicker of defiance. A quiet little fire that says, I know who I am, even if they don't let me say it out loud. And sometimes that's the beginning. By now you've come to accept that your body is no longer really your own. Maybe it never was. It's a thing passed between hands. Your fathers, your husbands, the churches. Everyone seems to have a claim. Everyone but you. But tonight, let's talk about something even more twisted. The idea of consent. Or rather, the fact that it doesn't exist here. Not for you. Not in any meaningful way. There's no word for it in your vocabulary. No space for it in your life. You were married off, most likely before your voice even settled into its adult tone, and when your husband came to your bed that first night, no one asked what you wanted. The idea that you might say no, laughable. Marriage in this time isn't a partnership, it's a contract, and your signature isn't required. Once you're wed, sex is part of the job description. Refusal? That's not a right, it's a sin. Or worse, an act of defiance that could lead to punishment. So you lie still, you pray, you grit your teeth and try to disappear into the cracks in the ceiling as it happens again and again. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes not, but it's never about you. Never about your desires, your comfort, or your safety. And the worst part? Everyone around you acts like this is just the way things are. You're expected to bear it with grace. As a woman, your silence is your virtue, your suffering is your sacrifice, and your pain, especially the kind you can't speak about, is your service to God. And yet there's a sickening awareness growing in your gut. You begin to understand that what happens to you in that bed, what has always happened, isn't just marriage. It's violence, even if no one calls it that, especially because no one calls it that. Here's a brutal historical fact to toss into your already full emotional cauldron. Under medieval law in most parts of Europe, a man could not be guilty of raping his wife. Not because it never happened, but because legally it was considered impossible. A woman's consent was viewed as something she gave permanently at the altar. Once you were married, your body became his right, his property, your suffering, irrelevant. If you resisted, you were accused of being rebellious or worse, hysterical. And there it is again. Hysteria, the ever-handy label for any woman who dared express pain, anger, or trauma. If you screamed, you were unstable. If you cried, dramatic. If you tried to fight back, well, now you were dangerous. Some women were even locked away or accused of witchcraft simply for acting unnaturally, which often meant being loud, opinionated, or visibly traumatized. The bar for suspicion was low, the price for rebellion, high. Now imagine a friend of yours, let's call her Alice, newly married, around your age, perhaps even younger. One day she confides in you, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She says her husband is cruel, that he takes what he wants even when she begs him to stop. You believe her, of course you do, but you also know what happens to girls who speak too freely. So you hush her. You tell her to be careful. You say, maybe you should pray more, and you hate yourself for it even as the words leave your mouth. But what else can you offer her? In this world, protection doesn't exist for girls like Elise. And then one day she's gone. No one says exactly where. Maybe she was sent back to her family in disgrace. Maybe she didn't survive childbirth. Or maybe she spoke too loudly and ended up in a convent. Or worse, underground. You'll never know. You just learn to speak even more quietly after that. Here's your quirky little historical tidbit. In some parts of Europe, there were legal chastity belts, commissioned by jealous husbands. actual contraptions meant to ensure a wife's loyalty by physically locking her up. Scholars still debate whether these were widely used or more symbolic, but the mere concept says everything. Men feared being betrayed, women feared everything else. And what about unmarried girls? They didn't have it easier. If you were a young peasant girl, working in someone else's fields or home, you were often at the mercy of your employer. Some were assaulted by lords or knights, men who knew no one would believe the word of a poor servant. If you became pregnant from such an assault, your options were bleak. Many were cast out, accused of seducing their attacker, or forced to give up their child. And if the man was powerful enough, he might be protected entirely. That's the ugly reality. Your virtue was a community concern when it came to shaming you, but not when it came to protecting you. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how women themselves interpreted these violations. Some argue that since there wasn't even language for consent or assault, as we understand them today, many girls didn't realise they had the right to say no in the first place. Others believe that trauma speaks its own language, regardless of the century. That even without words like rape or abuse, women knew what was being done to them. They may not have had the tools to fight it, but the pain was real and understood. So you keep your head down, you learn the rules, you teach your daughter to speak softly, to obey, to be good, not because you want her to be powerless, but because you think it might keep her alive. Maybe she'll marry a kind man, maybe she'll find her way to a convent with a library, maybe, just maybe, she'll get lucky. But in the back of your mind, a quiet fury builds, because you've seen too much, heard too many stories, and buried too many names whispered in fear. You've started to write them down, on scraps of linen, on the back of old prayers, not full names, just initials, maybe a single letter, but it's your way of keeping track, of not letting the world erase them completely. You tuck the scraps beneath a floorboard, behind a loose stone, somewhere they might one day be found. Maybe not by you, but by someone, anyone, because deep down there's a voice inside you that refuses to die. A truth that trembles even as you whisper it only in your own mind. What they did to us was not love. It was theft. It was silence. And we remember. It starts the moment you're married, or sometimes even before. You walk down the aisle, or stand awkwardly in a drafty chapel, and before the wine's even been poured or the feast begins, someone's already planning your next public test, proving your virginity. It's not enough to have waited. Not enough to say it. No, they want evidence. Tangible proof. And if that sounds medieval, well, that's because it is. Literally. The infamous church bed test is one of those horror stories that sounds too weird to be true. But in some parts of medieval Europe, especially among the nobility, a bride was expected to demonstrate her virginity after the wedding night by displaying blood-stained sheets to witnesses, usually women, sometimes family, sometimes servants. The logic? If you were truly a virgin, your hymen would tear and bleed during consummation. If there was no blood, questions were raised, accusations followed, and depending on your status or your dowry, you could be publicly shamed, divorced, or worse. You're terrified of this test long before it happens. You've heard stories. A cousin of yours was dragged back to her family's home the morning after her wedding because the sheets were clean. No one believed her when she swore she'd never so much as touched a boy. Her marriage was annulled, her name smeared across every dinner table for months. And the worst part? No one ever blamed the husband. Maybe he didn't even try. Maybe the bleeding just didn't happen. But the conclusion was always the same. The girl lied. The girl sinned. The girl was dirty. So you go into your own wedding night not just nervous, but strategically terrified. You're planning, scheming, hoping. Some girls pricked their own fingers to make sure there was blood. Others asked a trusted servant for help. In some cases, midwives were brought in to examine you beforehand, checking your body like livestock to verify your purity. It's dehumanizing, clinical, and cruel. But refusing? That's not an option. Refusing means guilt. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In some regions, the lack of virginity could void the entire marriage contract. That meant your husband could walk away without returning your dowry. You'd go home, shamed, blamed, and poorer than before. No one would marry you again. You'd become damaged goods. And even if you were telling the truth, if your virginity was taken by force long before, well, that didn't matter. You didn't tell anyone, did you? Because you knew what would happen if you did. There were no rape kits, no investigations, just shame, whispers, and suspicion. Some families would marry off daughters as fast as possible after an assault to cover the dishonour. Others might try to keep it secret, locking the girl away, insisting she never speak of it again. The girl herself, well, she learned quickly that silence was the safest language. The test itself could be public or private. Among the peasantry, it was usually a small ritual, whispered about, checked by elder women. Among the nobility, it was spectacle. The couple was led to bed with a parade of torches and chants, and the next morning the sheets were displayed for all to see. In some regions, the husband's friends would joke loudly about his conquest, as if your first night of pain and fear were a badge of honour for him and a trial for you. And let's not even get into the cases where the husband wanted to disgrace you. Maybe he didn't want the marriage anymore. Maybe your dowry wasn't as impressive as expected. Maybe he just liked another girl better. If he claimed you weren't a virgin, and the sheets didn't say otherwise, you were done for. Innocence didn't matter. Reputation did. And here's the thing. Medically, the hymen is unreliable at best. Some girls are born without one. Others lose it through normal activity. Riding horses, climbing trees, even just existing. But that nuance? Lost entirely in medieval thought. To them, virginity was binary. You had it, or you didn't. And the only proof they trusted was blood. A fringe belief in some parts even held that if a woman bled too much, it meant she was full of sinful lust, being punished by God. Too little blood? You were impure. Too much? You were corrupt. It was a lose-lose scenario. A test you could never truly pass. So imagine you're lying there on your wedding night. The fire's burning low, you're still in pain. Your new husband is snoring beside you, fully satisfied and possibly already drunk again. You can't sleep. Your heart is thudding like a war drum in your chest. Because soon the women will come to check. They'll look at the sheets. They'll look at you. And in that moment, they'll decide your fate. If the blood's there, you've bought yourself some time, at least a little. But if it's not, the questions begin. You might find yourself on the receiving end of a priest's harsh sermon, or a father-in-law's cold stare, or a mother-in-law's hissed warnings, and worst of all, your husband might begin to treat you differently, not with anger, but with indifference, as if you failed at your first and only important task, and once that doubt sets in, it doesn't go away. Every fight, every missed period, every quiet moment becomes another reminder that he doesn't trust you. You become the problem. And all because of one night, one outdated belief, one stained or unstained sheet. Here's the open scholarly debate. How much did women internalise this? Were they just surviving the system, or did they actually believe in it? Some writings suggest that women themselves enforced these tests. Mothers, aunts, midwives. They believed it was necessary to protect their family's honour. But maybe, just maybe, it was more complex. Maybe these women knew how rigged the game was and tried to help girls pass in secret. Maybe the ones who looked sternest were also the ones slipping sharp needles into soft hands and whispering, "Just a drop, make sure they see it." You don't know what to believe anymore. You've learned to pretend, to smile when you're scared, to bow your head when you're angry, to keep quiet when you want to scream, because no matter what you feel, everyone else is watching what you prove. The blood, the sheets, the silence. And somewhere, in the dark of your mind, you begin to understand a terrifying truth. Your entire value in this world is built on something invisible, unknowable, and wildly misunderstood. And yet you're expected to protect it with your life. There's a moment when you're about 15, maybe 16, when something inside you cracks. Not in the breaking sense, but in the awakening sense. You've done everything right. You've stayed quiet. You've endured the wedding night, the tests, the watchful stares. You've prayed when they told you to and obeyed without complaint. But you're starting to realise something terrifying. No one ever taught you anything real about your own body. No one even tried. What little knowledge you do have came from whispers, riddles, and superstition. Your mother gave you a few warnings, vague, nervous things like, "Don't sit too close to boys," or "Too much heat in your blood can invite the devil." A neighbour once muttered something about how lust makes your bones rot, and you didn't ask for clarification because, well, where would you even start? So when your body starts doing strange things, aches, fevers, cravings, unexplainable shifts, you're left with fear. You don't know what's normal. You don't know what's dangerous. You just know it's happening, and no one is giving you answers. The medieval version of sex education is about as helpful as being handed a leech and told to trust the stars. Your understanding of reproduction is a chaotic patchwork of religious dogma, folklore, and old wives' tales. You've heard that babies are formed by mixing the man's seed with the woman's blood. Some say it's the heat of the man's passion that creates a child. Others say it's a blessing sent by God, and only pious couples can conceive. You once overheard a woman say you should sleep with your head pointing east for a boy and west for a girl. That's about the level of science you're working with. Now here's your solid historical fact. For much of the Middle Ages, the dominant medical theories in Europe were based on the writings of Galen, an ancient Greek physician. Galen believed that women's bodies were simply inverted male bodies, that your womb was just a penis turned inward. This bizarre theory led to some truly wild assumptions, like the idea that menstruation was your body's way of purging excess heat and bile, or that the womb could wander around inside your body if it got too bored or lonely. Yes, really. The wandering womb was a serious diagnosis, believed to cause everything from choking to hysteria to fainting spells. And if that wasn't strange enough, you also hear warnings about demons, specifically succubi, female spirits who supposedly seduced men in their sleep. But there was a lesser-known fear whispered among women. The incubus, a demon that attacked women at night, sometimes blamed for unwanted pregnancies. If you were found with child but didn't have a husband, well, claiming an incubus visited you might save your life. Probably not, but maybe. That's how desperate things got. So when your own body starts betraying you, when your monthly bleeding becomes irregular, or your stomach feels tight and strange, you panic. Are you ill? Are you cursed? Is something moving inside you? You're terrified to ask, because asking implies you know too much, and knowing too much in your world makes you suspicious. Remember, curiosity isn't encouraged in girls, especially not about anything involving your body. If you ask too many questions, someone might assume you've done something shameful. You might be labelled immodest, or worse, accused of having learned things in sinful ways from a man. Knowledge, like sex, is something you're supposed to receive passively, never pursue on your own. One afternoon, you sneak into the garden behind the house where the older women gather. They're boiling herbs and drying roots, talking about a neighbour who lost a child in the night. You sit quietly, hoping to learn something. Anything, and you do. One of them mentions mugwort tea to ease cramps. Another warns against drinking too much pennyroyal. It might loosen the womb. You listen harder. These aren't just recipes. These are coded instructions. Some of them are for comfort. Some, you realise slowly, are meant to prevent pregnancy, and some, meant to end one. And now we hit the truly hushed corner of medieval womanhood. Herbal birth control. Yes, it existed. Not openly, and certainly not safely, but it was there. Midwives and wise women passed down recipes made from common plants. Wild carrot seed, tansy, rue. Some were believed to prevent conception. Others were taken after a missed period to bring on the bleeding. Everyone pretended it was just to regulate the cycle. No one dared say the real word, but everyone knew. It was dangerous, of course, not just because of side effects or dosages, but because discovery could lead to accusations of witchcraft. Yes, that word hangs heavy in the background now, doesn't it? Witch. All it meant for most women was that you knew too much, or that you helped other women without permission. If you were caught giving another girl a secret tea or rubbing a strange paste on her belly, you could be brought before a local court, or worse, a church tribunal. Here's your quirky historical fact. Some medieval scholars believed that menstrual blood was toxic, that even touching it could spoil crops, sour wine, or make dogs go mad. Women were considered unclean during their periods. In some places, you weren't allowed to enter church while bleeding. Imagine being told that your natural body cycle was not only shameful, but spiritually dangerous, and yet no one tells you how to manage it. There are no cloth pads, no instructions, no privacy. You're expected to deal with it quietly, discreetly, and with total shame. Blood-stained garments, your fault, cramps, God's punishment, cravings. Maybe the devil is tempting you, and through it all you're still expected to work, cook, serve, and submit. Bleed quietly, smile politely. You start to envy the older women, not because they're free, but because they know. They've mapped their own bodies through pain and trial. They carry remedies in their aprons, wisdom in their silences. They've learned the rules of survival in a world that makes your biology feel like a curse. You want that knowledge. You need it. But you also know that seeking it too openly could cost you everything. So you start collecting fragments. A recipe whispered here, a story told in metaphor there, a dried sprig of something tucked into your pocket, its name unspoken but its power undeniable. You begin to build a secret understanding, not of what your body should be, according to the church or your husband, but what it actually is. You start learning how to live inside it, not proudly, not loudly, but with a stubborn sort of grace. And in those moments, when you hide a stolen truth beneath your mattress, or memorize the rhythm of your bleeding in secret, you begin to feel something radical. Not shame, not fear, power. Your back aches in a way it didn't before. Your ankles swell before your eyes. Your breasts, once merely monitored for signs of fertility, now ache with heaviness and leak without warning. You're pregnant again. Or still. Honestly, it's starting to blur together. You had one child, then another. One didn't make it. Another barely did. And now you're growing heavy with another, and each time it feels less like a miracle and more like a countdown. There's no glowing period of motherhood here, no maternity leave, no pickles and ice cream cravings, no doting husband who rubs your feet by the fire. You're not resting, you're working, scrubbing, cooking, hauling. Your body is a labour machine, a production unit, and what you produce must be alive, healthy and preferably male. You're told this constantly. A boy to carry the name, a boy to work the fields, a boy to fight. Boys are future, girls are dowries, debts. And yet, here you are, hoping, against everything you've been taught, for a daughter. Maybe because you want someone to talk to. Maybe because you believe you can protect her better than you were protected. Maybe because it feels like your only quiet rebellion. But even that hope is tinged with guilt, because you know what a daughter's life looks like. You know what she'll endure, what she'll be expected to tolerate, what she'll be punished for resisting. If you raise her right, quiet, obedient, modest, she might survive. If you raise her wrong, curious, outspoken, defiant, she might burn. Your thoughts spiral as your belly grows. Sleep becomes a stranger. Every movement sends a ripple of worry through your spine. Is the baby too high, too low? Did you feel a kick? Was that a kick or just hunger? You don't know. No one tells you, and you can't exactly walk down to a medieval clinic and ask a kindly nurse. Instead, you go to the midwife. She knows more than any man in town. Her hands are rough and stained with age, but she's delivered more babies than anyone can count. She listens to your stomach, presses here, taps there, squints at your ankles. Then she gives you a crooked smile and mutters something about the moon's pull. You're not sure if she's being poetic or serious, but honestly, at this point you'll take any comfort. You ask her, carefully, quietly, what happens if the baby comes too early, or too late, or breech, or silent. She doesn't answer directly, just gives you a cup of bitter herbs and says to keep praying. And you do, though it's more like bargaining now. Please, just let this one live. Let me live. Here's a horrifying historical fact to tuck under your pillow. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in the Middle Ages. Not war, not famine, not plague, childbirth. Infections were common, blood loss almost expected, and complications endless. Midwives did what they could, but they worked without clean tools, without pain relief, without real medical knowledge. Sometimes they had to cut you open, not with scalpels, just knives. Or if the baby was stuck, they might use hooks. You're quite literally gambling your life every time you bring one into the world. And the church, of course, had opinions. A woman in labour was encouraged to confess her sins as early as possible, just in case she died before the baby came. That way, her soul wouldn't be dragged to hell in the middle of a contraction. You think about that sometimes, mid-scream. How absurd it is that your salvation depends on whether or not you confessed before the bleeding started. Here's something stranger. If a woman died in labour and the baby was still inside, the midwife, if religious enough and brave enough, might try to cut the child out after death. Why? Because if the baby lived long enough to be baptised, its soul could be saved. If not, it was thought to linger in limbo, stuck between heaven and damnation. That's how powerful baptism was, and how disposable the mother became. Your death was expected. The child's afterlife was the real priority. And what if the baby was born with a defect? A cleft lip, a crooked spine, missing fingers. People whispered, maybe it was a sign, maybe you sinned, or maybe you had relations with a demon in your sleep. Yes, that was a theory, especially if the baby looked strange or died quickly. Deformities were often linked to witchcraft or divine punishment. As if you didn't already feel enough shame, you now had to carry the idea that your child's suffering was your fault. Spiritually, physically, morally, all of it. There's a scholarly debate you've heard about whether this constant death and danger made medieval women emotionally distant from their children, whether they were cautious with love, because any child might be gone by next week. Others argue the opposite, that mothers clung harder, loved fiercer, because time was so short. You don't have the luxury to debate. You just love your children with the same desperation you breathe with. You name them carefully, names with meaning, names that sound strong in prayers, and you don't sleep unless they're breathing. You've held a cold baby before. You know the weight. You know how terrifying silence can be, still you have to keep going. There are other mouths to feed, other wounds to hide. You walk even when it hurts. You lift even when your muscles tremble. You smile when you feel like collapsing, because someone's always watching. Your husband, your mother-in-law, the neighbours, the priest. And God. Always God. And when the time comes, when the baby kicks in that final way and your body starts to shudder like a collapsing roof, you kneel. Because there's no such thing as lying down in a clean room with helpful hands and sweet music. No, you kneel, you scream, you bleed. If you're lucky, it's quick. If not, it's hours of agony. The walls blur. The voices around you sound like they're underwater. You beg, you curse, you whisper the names of women who didn't survive. And when it's over, if it ends with a cry instead of silence, you laugh, or cry, or both, because you're still here. You survived another round. But as you hold the baby close, as the afterbirth is burned in the fire, and the sheets are washed in silence, you know it's only a matter of time before it all begins again. And so you whisper, half prayer, half threat, let this be the last. Please, just let me rest. You'd think widowhood would bring freedom, that once the man dies, your husband, your lord, your keeper, you'd finally get to breathe without asking permission. But of course, in your world, nothing is that simple. When your husband dies, whether from illness, battle, or simply choking on a poorly chewed bit of mutton, you don't step into independence, you just step into another set of chains. Softer maybe, but still chains. You're a widow now. That word should carry weight, dignity, even power. But it comes wrapped in suspicion and restriction. People watch you more than ever. Men who used to ignore you now whisper about what you'll do with your newfound freedom. Women eye you with a mix of pity and distance. Some assume you'll remarry. Others wonder if you already have someone waiting in the shadows. But everyone agrees on one thing. You're a woman alone, and that makes you dangerous. Let's rewind a little. When your husband died, the first thing the village wanted to know, before they even lowered his body into the ground, was what he left behind. Not in the sentimental sense. No one's asking about his favourite stories or whether he loved you. No, they're asking about his property, his debts, and whether you've produced a male heir. Because if you haven't, you're probably in trouble. In many medieval cultures, your ability to remain in your home depended entirely on whether you had a son old enough to inherit. If you did, great. You became a kind of temporary steward, managing things until he came of age. But if your children were all daughters, or if your sons died young, or if you had no children at all, suddenly your position gets shaky. The land passes to the next male relative, not to you, never to you. You might be allowed to stay on as a sort of guest in your own home, if the new lord is generous. If not, you're packed off to live with family or worse, pushed into a nunnery. Your grief barely has time to form before the pressure begins. Where will you go? What will you do? Who will take you in? And let's not forget the church, which has plenty to say about widows. You are now a woman of sorrow, expected to dress plainly, speak softly, and avoid any behaviour that could be seen as joyful. Laughter, colour, singing, all of it is suspect. Your virtue is under renewed surveillance. You're no longer protected by a husband's claim, so any independence you show now is interpreted through the lens of sin. Are you secretly looking for another man? Are you enjoying being on your own a little too much? People wonder. They talk. Here's your historical fact. In many areas of Europe, widows were expected to remain celibate unless they remarried. And if they did choose to remarry, they often needed permission, from the church, from their late husband's family, or even from the local lord. You couldn't just go off and find a new partner, not unless someone said you could. But let's say you don't want to remarry. You want to be left alone, to raise your children, to live quietly. That's suspicious too. A woman alone is a threat. Who's keeping you in line? Who's guiding your morals? People might start interpreting your every move as seduction. You wore a blue ribbon, too bright. You went to the market without a chaperone. Bold of you. You spoke to the blacksmith for longer than necessary. Scandalous. And God help you if you're still young and remotely attractive. Now you're a magnet for rumours. Every man who looks at you becomes a potential scandal. Every smile is dissected. Some might approach you directly, offering help, friendship, or protection. And under that, expectation. As if your widowhood is just a pause between possessions. As if your body, now unclaimed, is fair game. Of course, if you're older or poor, the tone shifts. You're not tempting. You're a burden. A sad, grey figure who mustn't take up too much space. You might become the subject of pity, or worse, charity. People might drop off scraps or invite you to meals with the same tone they'd use for a stray dog. You must always appear grateful, quiet, humble, and if you complain, ingrate, shrew, witch. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some widows wore special rings to signify their status, not as mourning symbols but as public signs that they were not to be flirted with. These were meant to protect them, but they also served as a reminder, this woman is claimed by grief. Approach with caution, or better yet, not at all. There's a complicated scholarly debate about the power of widowhood. Some argue that, compared to daughters or wives, widows actually had the most autonomy. They could own property, manage estates, and wield influence, if they were wealthy or noble. And yes, there are examples of widows running businesses, lending money, even writing wills and managing courts. But for most, widowhood was just another kind of survival game. One where the stakes were quieter, but just as high. Because being a widow didn't make you free, it made you visible. And visibility, for a woman in your world, is rarely safe. Still, you begin to feel something unexpected in the silence after his death. Not happiness, not relief exactly, but space. Space to think, to move, to feel, without bracing for someone else's touch or command. You start sleeping differently, deeper. You find yourself walking at dawn, when the fields are misty and the sky is a soft grey bruise, and there's no one asking where you're going. You start to remember who you were before marriage, if such a person ever really existed. And maybe, for the first time, you do something for yourself. You take a book if you can read, or learn to write if you can't. Or you plant something in the earth, something just for beauty, not food. A flower, hidden near the edge of the house. Something that doesn't feed anyone, doesn't earn anything, but exists just because you wanted it to. It's a small act, but it feels like rebellion. It feels like a whisper to the world. I am still here, and I belong to no one. It's not just your behaviour they want to control, it's your body, down to the fabric that covers it. As soon as you could walk, someone started telling you what not to wear. And now, even as a grown woman, widow or wife, noble or peasant, your wardrobe is policed by a system that treats clothing like a moral compass. Because apparently the colour of your sleeves or the cut of your neckline can drag entire communities into sin. You see it in the way people watch you. Eyes linger not in admiration but calculation. Are your skirts too tight? Is your hair too long? Are you wearing jewellery that might suggest vanity? You learn early on that anything beautiful about you is dangerous. You must appear plain, modest, humble, forgettable. Not because it's practical, but because beauty in a woman, especially a young one, is always assumed to be for someone else's temptation. And if that temptation leads to sin, well, that's on you. Let's start with hair. In the medieval world, hair is almost scandalously symbolic. For an unmarried girl, long hair represents virginity, innocence. But it must be braided and covered, especially in church. Once you're married, your hair is no longer yours. You're expected to cover it with a veil or wimple, exposing your hair in public. That's not just frowned upon, it's viewed as immodest at best and adulterous at worst. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval towns, laws were passed to regulate how women dressed, particularly lower-class women, who were seen as pretending to be noble. Sumptuary laws, they were called. These laws dictated what materials you could wear, how bright your clothes could be, and even which accessories were legal for your social class. Silk, off limits unless you were high-ranking nobility. Fur, only if your husband had a title. Red shoes, you'd better have the paperwork to prove you're rich or risk a fine, or worse. And yet, men were not held to these same standards. A man could wear bright colours, feathered hats, weapons, and velvet. He could strut like a peacock, and no one questioned his virtue. But if your neckline dipped an inch too low, suddenly the entire village thought you were seducing every priest and ploughboy in a 10-mile radius. Your clothing was never just clothing. It was a statement, whether you wanted it to be or not. Even colours carried meaning. Black was for widows and mourners. Blue, especially deep indigo, was considered pure, often associated with the Virgin Mary. Red, dangerous, passionate, scandalous. A red dress could mark you as a harlot, even if it was the only one you owned. You once saw a girl nearly whipped in public for wearing a red sash to a festival. "She's inviting sin," the priest said, as if fabric could shout blasphemy. And if you worked in a brothel, or were simply accused of being loose, you might be forced to wear certain colours permanently. Some towns made prostitutes wear yellow headscarves or striped cloaks, like social branding, as if that alone could protect the good people from wickedness, as if the real danger wasn't the men sneaking into those same brothels after Vespers. Now here's a quirky historical tidbit for you. In one German town in the 14th century, there were actual ordinances against women wearing long-pointed shoes. Yes, shoes. Apparently they were considered too seductive, drawing attention to the shape of your foot, and therefore by some deranged logic the rest of you. So if you were caught wearing them, you could be fined or even shamed in public. Fashion was a sin if it made a woman desirable, but it was power if it made a man imposing. It wasn't just what you wore, it was how you wore it. Was your tunic too tight? Your veil too sheer? Your belt tied too high on your waist, drawing the eye? Did you laugh too loudly while wearing that? Did you sway when you walked? All of it was monitored. Not always openly, but constantly. And what made it worse was that the people doing the monitoring weren't just priests or lords. They were other women. Your neighbour, your mother-in-law, that quiet girl from the market who never liked you much. Because everyone was taught the same lesson. A woman's modesty is the measure of her worth, and that modesty had to be seen to be believed. You start to internalise it. You look at your own reflection with suspicion. Is this dress too nice? Should you leave your hair down just this once? Will someone think you're vain? Or worse, inviting something? You begin to shrink yourself, not just physically but spiritually. You stop dancing at festivals. You stop laughing with your whole chest. You learn how to disappear without actually leaving. And let's say you don't conform. Let's say you wear that forbidden brooch, or let your hair show, or walk with confidence that someone mistakes for arrogance. Now you're asking for it. That phrase doesn't need to be said aloud. It hangs in the air like smoke. If something happens to you, if you're grabbed, groped, shamed, it's your fault, not his hand, your hemline. There's a debate among historians about how much women themselves believed in this dress code policing. Did they genuinely see it as necessary? Or was it just survival? Playing the game because that's what kept you safe? Either way, you know the feeling, the constant calculation, the exhausting awareness of your own visibility. And it's not just in town or at church. Even in your own home, you're expected to maintain modesty. If you live with your in-laws, you share space. So much space. There's no privacy. You bathe quickly, fully clothed if anyone else is around. You dress behind curtains if you're lucky. You sleep in shifts, sometimes with children beside you, and you know better than to ever be seen relaxing. Ever. But in the smallest of ways, you rebel. You stitch a flower into your apron, just beneath the fold. You hem your sleeves in a colour that's just barely visible, a shade of blue so pale it feels like a secret. You wear your hair loose under your veil because it's your hair, and for a few hours no one can see it but you. These are not grand acts. No one's going to sing about them in the marketplace. But they are yours. You start to dream of a world where you could choose what to wear, not to please or displease, but just to be. To feel silk on your skin without guilt, to wear red without consequence, to walk into a room without wondering what judgment waits in the corners. But until that world exists, you stay careful. You stay covered. You keep your colour to yourself. Not because you're ashamed, because they can't take what they can't see. It doesn't take much to ruin your life. One wrong look, one wrong word, One step outside the invisible lines they've drawn around your body, your voice, your place in the world. If you're lucky, they'll call you immodest. If you're not, they'll call you a witch or a whore. And once one of those labels sticks, there's no scraping it off. You've spent your entire life trying to balance on the edge of that blade. Too quiet, you're hiding something. Too loud, you're seeking attention. Too pretty, you're a temptation. Too plain, you're a failure. There is no version of you that is fully acceptable, only tolerable. Until, of course, you do something, say something, wear something, become something that tips the balance, and then they descend. It might start with gossip, whispers in the market, sidelong glances during mass. A friend stops answering the door, someone pretends not to see you on the path. Your name gets said more often, but never to your face. You're mentioned in low tones paired with words like bold and strange and unfeminine. You find yourself being watched more closely, especially by those who never noticed you before. That's the thing about a community like this. Everyone's waiting for someone to fall. Let's say you're a healer. You grow herbs. You know what to give a woman whose moon cycle won't come, or whose child won't sleep, or whose husband hits her. You don't ask for payment most of the time. You don't advertise. You just help. And people come. Quietly. Gratefully. Until someone's child dies anyway. Or someone's jealous husband decides your teas are too effective. Or the priest notices too many women gathering at your doorstep. Now you're not just a helpful neighbour. You're suspicious. Maybe you're using dark magic. Maybe you've made a deal with the devil. Maybe that dried root you gave out wasn't just for cramps. You think you're helping, but the world sees a threat. And suddenly, all those little things, your independence, your knowledge, your lack of shame, become evidence. Here's your hard historical fact. In late medieval Europe, accusations of witchcraft surged, especially against women who lived alone, healed others, or behaved in ways deemed unnatural. It wasn't always about magic. Often, it was about control. A woman who didn't rely on a man was a problem. A woman who seemed to wield power without permission. A target. The same went for women accused of promiscuity. You didn't have to actually sleep with anyone. You just had to look like you might. Or worse, make someone want to. If a man in town had impure thoughts about you, guess who got the blame? Not him, you, your smile, your skirt, your voice. And if you were beautiful, that was enough. Beauty was both a gift and a death sentence, because while it drew men in, it also gave women a reason to hate you. And it only took one rumour to collapse everything. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, women accused of adultery or lustful behaviour were paraded through town wearing only their shift, or worse. Public shaming was not just accepted, it was ritualised. They'd hang signs around your neck, dump ashes on your head, or force you to ride backward on a donkey while people jeered. It was theatre, designed to strip you of dignity and remind everyone watching that this is what happens to girls who step out of line. And what line exactly did you cross? That's the worst part. You don't always know. One day you're praised for being pious, and the next you're accused of being a serpent in disguise. Maybe you spoke up when a man touched you. Maybe you turned down a suitor. Maybe you danced a little too freely at a feast. It doesn't matter. The system is hungry, and shame is its currency. You try to defend yourself at first. You tell the truth. You swear you've done nothing wrong. But the more you speak, the guiltier you sound. That's the trap. Protesting too much means you're hiding something. Staying silent means you're sulking. Either way, you lose. And if it goes too far, if a local priest decides your presence is corrupting the community, you might find yourself facing something much worse than whispers. Because once you've been labelled, everything you've ever done is reinterpreted through that lens. Your childhood tantrums become signs of an unruly spirit. That time you fell ill and muttered nonsense during a fever. Possession. The dreams you had about flying. Witch flight. You become a character in someone else's morality play, and you don't even get to write your own lines. Some scholars argue that these accusations weren't just about individual women. They were about controlling all women. Every trial, every public shaming, every whispered story reminded girls like you to stay in line, to obey, to fear, and it worked. You watched others fall and you learned from their silence. You buried your questions, folded your ambition into small invisible corners, you wore dull colours, you kept your eyes low. Survival was its own kind of sorcery, but sometimes, despite all this caution, They come for you anyway. A knock at the door in the middle of the night, a summons to the local court, a cold room filled with men who already believe you're guilty. They don't need real evidence, just testimony, hearsay, an accusation from someone they trust. Maybe a man who once touched you and didn't like how you pulled away. Maybe a woman who envies your confidence. Maybe no one at all. Just the wind of suspicion that's been swirling for weeks. You stand there, hands trembling, and try to explain that you're just a person. A daughter, a mother, a neighbour. You bake bread. You pray. You mean no harm. But no one listens. They've already chosen the ending. So you stop pleading. You lift your chin just slightly and meet their eyes. If you're going to be a villain in their story, you might as well look the part. You speak your name clearly. You breathe slowly. You remember all the women who came before you, those who were burned, drowned, silenced. You wonder if anyone will remember you. And in that final moment, as they condemn you with righteous certainty, you feel something fierce, like a fire in your chest. Not fear, not shame, just rage. You learn quickly that the rules don't apply to men, or rather, they apply when it's convenient and vanish the moment they become uncomfortable. You've spent your entire life being judged by a scale so warped it may as well have been carved by a blind drunk. And as it turns out, the scale tips dramatically in favour of the boys. They say men have urges, and that these are natural, uncontrollable even. The priests preach about resisting temptation, sure, but the warnings are always heavier on the girls. It's your job not to tempt, your job not to be seen, your job to be the lock, while the man is the key. And if too many doors are opened, well, the key is still valuable, but the lock, it's broken, worthless. You watch your brothers grow up with space to roam and the freedom to speak their minds. They're allowed to misbehave, even encouraged. Boys will be boys, they say. They can sneak off into the woods, chase girls, make rude jokes, and it's all brushed off with chuckles and backpats. But you so much as giggle at the wrong moment and your mother is muttering prayers to the Virgin and warning you that your soul is teetering on the edge of ruin. And here's the cruelest irony. The same society that punishes you for being attractive also punishes you for not being attractive enough. If you're pretty, you're a threat. If you're plain, you're forgettable, and therefore less valuable on the marriage market. Either way, you lose. Meanwhile, men can be scarred, pot-bellied, old, and still be considered desirable if they have land or titles. You have one currency, your body, and if it's deemed spoiled, there's no exchange rate, no second chance. Here's your historical fact. In medieval England, the church recognised male concubinage as a sin, but one that could be managed. Priests themselves kept mistresses, sometimes openly. In fact, some even fathered children while still standing at the pulpit preaching abstinence. And while this was technically frowned upon, most of the time it was tolerated. But if a nun was caught in a similar situation, that was scandal, heresy, sometimes punishable by death. This wasn't just about religion, it was about control. Men's transgressions were seen as lapses, yours were character flaws, moral rot, unforgivable, and the consequences fell squarely on your shoulders. If a man seduced you, or worse, you were still the one marked. He'd go back to his life. You'd carry the shame, or the child, or both. There's a story you hear in hushed tones about a local girl, Marian. She was 16, pretty, lively, laughed too much, some said. A visiting knight took an interest in her. Everyone saw it. He flirted. She smiled. He gave her a necklace. And then one day she disappeared for 2 nights. When she returned, she was different. Silent. Pale. The knight was gone, off to his next stop. And within a week, the whispers started. She asked for it. She followed him. She should have known better. Her parents tried to send her to a convent. The nuns turned her away. Eventually she took ill. Or maybe she drank something to end the pregnancy people were sure she carried. No one visited her after that. Her house grew quieter and quieter until one day it was empty. Just like that. A story, then a warning, then a footnote. And no one ever blamed the knight. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some medieval communities believed that if a woman conceived from rape, it meant she must have secretly enjoyed it, that her pleasure had made conception possible. Yes, this was actually written down in legal discussions, the kind of logic that makes your blood run cold. The moment you start to understand just how deeply this world distrusts your voice, your experience, your pain, And let's not forget about marriage. Men could seek annulments for the strangest reasons. If a wife didn't produce children fast enough, if she wasn't obedient, if he suspected, without proof, that she hadn't been a virgin. Meanwhile, your options for leaving a cruel or violent husband? None. If he beat you, the church told you to pray. If he humiliated you, they told you to forgive. You were married, and that was that. Your suffering was seen as noble, holy even. The more you endured, the more grace you earned. Some historians argue that women in convents, those who entered by choice, were not escaping religion, but escaping men. In a cloister, you might still be under rules, but at least no one was breathing down your neck in the dark or using your body like a tool. Of course, that life came with its own horrors, but at least it offered one thing this world never gives freely to women: space. Still, not everyone made it to a convent. Most were stuck in this double-standard world where men were allowed to sin and laugh about it later, while you were expected to shoulder the fallout of their actions in silence. Where male lust was nature, but female existence was temptation. Where boys wrote bawdy songs and praised each other for exploits, and you couldn't even walk to the market without keeping your eyes to the ground, so you shrink yourself. You teach your daughters to do the same. Keep your voice soft, your steps smaller. Don't draw attention. Don't speak unless spoken to. And definitely don't let anyone think you want anything. Desire, after all, is dangerous, especially in a girl, especially if it shows. You start to resent the way men move, the way they talk over you, the way they laugh too loudly in rooms that go silent when you enter. You notice how they touch things, your things, without asking, how their eyes linger like hands, how they tell you what you are without ever really knowing you. But the worst part, you begin to notice how the women around you enforce these rules too. Your mother, your aunts, the neighbour across the way. They scold you for being too confident, warn you not to wear your hair that way. They aren't cruel, they're scared, and they're trying to save you, because they know what happens to girls who forget their place. So you begin to write your story differently, not with ink and parchment, but in the way you carry yourself, in the quiet defiance of teaching your daughter to read, in sharing a knowing look with the midwife when someone says something vile, in braiding your hair the way your friend used to before she was shamed into silence. The world may belong to men, but inside that world you carve out something of your own, even if it's only a sliver, even if you have to fight for it one breath at a time. You always imagined that being born into nobility would spare you from the worst of it, that the high stone walls, the silks, the servants, the careful education in Latin prayers and table manners would somehow soften the weight of being a woman. After all, they tell you that noble girls are lucky, that you're chosen, special, cared for like prized roses in a royal garden. But now you know better. Being noble doesn't save you, it just changes the shape of your cage. Your life is ruled by schedules and surveillance. You wake when you're told, dress in layers you didn't choose, eat what's decided for you, and smile on command. Everything about you is rehearsed. Even your silence. You're trained, not raised. Groomed for alliances. Polished like a gemstone to be placed in the perfect crown. If you're clever, you learn how to nod in all the right places, how to speak just enough to seem refined, but not so much that anyone suspects you might have thoughts of your own. You're watched constantly, by your governess, your attendants, your father's steward, the visiting friars, the guards who linger near your chamber door like shadows made of rules. Your body is a fortress they pretend to guard, but really they're guarding the key, your virginity. Not for you, but for your future husband. And behind every lesson, every stitch sewn in your embroidery hoop, every sermon you memorize is the same message. Stay pure, stay still, stay quiet. You read romance poetry in secret, of course. Pages tucked into the covers of your prayer book. Verses written by dead men who imagined love as some chivalric quest, where a lady's favour inspires heroism. You dream just a little of being loved like that, of someone seeing you beyond the veil and the titles and the silk gowns. But those stories aren't meant for real girls. You know it. You don't get love. You get a dowry and a man who's probably older than your father. And when that day comes, the engagement, the contracts, the ritual exchanges, you're just 15, maybe 16. The man they choose for you is powerful, wealthy, and mostly indifferent. You meet him once before the wedding. He smells like wine and cloves. His smile doesn't reach his eyes. When he leaves, your mother tells you he'll take good care of you, and your father says, "This match secures our lands." Not your heart, not your consent, just the borders of your family's legacy. Here's your historical fact. In noble families, daughters were often married off as part of military or political alliances, with no regard for their personal preferences. In some cases, girls were promised at birth and married before the age of 13. Some were even sent away to live with their future in-laws as wards, to be raised by the very families that would later control them. Their bodies weren't just betrothed, they were assimilated. The marriage happens quickly. You're led into a hall lit with too many candles, the scent of melted tallow thick in your throat. You wear a dress you can barely walk in, your head heavy with a gold circlet you're not allowed to adjust. And when you say the vows, when your hands are joined, when the rings are exchanged, you hear your voice as if it belongs to someone else. This isn't a celebration, it's a transaction sealed with witnesses and wine. And afterward, you're paraded to the bedchamber like a prize hog at a harvest fair. Servants light the fires, fluff the sheets, and then stand awkwardly nearby as your husband begins to undress, watching you with the bored hunger of someone inspecting a meal. You're expected to lie still, to endure, to provide proof of consummation by morning. There will be blood on the sheets, they say, and it will mean everything. Not just for your reputation, but for your family's legacy. Here's the part no one tells you. Noble women have less freedom than peasants in some ways. A peasant girl might marry someone from her own village. She might work beside her husband. She might run away if things get bad enough. But you're trapped in a stone keep, surrounded by politics and servants and locked doors. You can't run. You can't even walk in the garden without a maid 2 steps behind you. Your cage is beautiful, yes, but it's still a cage. You're expected to host feasts, birth heirs, and play the delicate game of court politics. Smile at your rivals, flatter your enemies, pretend you didn't hear the rumours about your husband's mistress, pretend not to notice the way he treats the maids, pretend the bruises on your arms are from the stairs, not from the nights when he comes back angry and decides you're the nearest thing to punch. There's a scholarly debate about whether noble women had more influence than we assume. Some managed large estates, wrote letters that swayed kings, even advised their husbands, but always behind the curtain, quiet power, and always under the threat of being replaced by another woman, by a younger girl, or by scandal. One accusation of adultery, one stillbirth too many, and your carefully constructed life can unravel in a day. So you learn to maneuver. You learn how to eavesdrop without looking like you're listening. You learn how to compliment without sincerity, how to disarm a threat with a single curtsy. You start hiding your intelligence in politeness, your anger in embroidery. You begin to understand that subtlety is your sword and survival your game. You're lonely, of course. So lonely it gnaws at you in the quiet moments, when the halls go dark and the laughter fades and you lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering who you might have been in another life. One where your name didn't belong to someone else. One where you got to choose. And maybe, just maybe, you find a sliver of rebellion. A letter hidden beneath your mattress, addressed to someone you'll never send it to. A meeting with a servant who makes you laugh. A poem carved into the windowsill in a language no one else reads. Tiny cracks in the wall, no one notices but you. This is your kingdom now, your prison, your stage, and somehow your sanctuary too. Because even here, even behind locked doors and silk curtains, you are still you, and they haven't managed to take that away. Not yet. No stone walls, no embroidery hoops, no Latin lessons or silk gowns. You're not a noble woman, you're a peasant girl, and your life is something entirely different, less delicate, more raw. There's no time to worry about veils or court gossip or whether your marriage will result in a political alliance. You're too busy hauling water, feeding chickens, and trying to survive the dirt, the cold, and the expectations that still crush you, just in different clothes. You wake before the sun rises every morning in a one-room cottage you share with 6, maybe 8 other people. The floor is packed earth, the roof leaks when it rains. You sleep on straw stuffed into a sack next to your siblings, elbow to elbow, knees curled into one another just to stay warm. There is no privacy, there is no silence, just the rhythm of survival, beat after beat after beat. Your body begins working before your hands even know what they're doing. You light the fire if it hasn't gone out overnight. You sweep the floor, stir the pot of porridge, feed the livestock if you have any, and then it's off to the fields, or the woods, or someone else's house if you're old enough to work as a maid. You carry, scrub, dig, mend. By the time you're 13, You're as strong as a grown man, but no one will say that to your face, because strength in a girl is not admired, it's assumed, exploited, and then ignored. You don't wear beautiful things. Your dress is coarse wool or linen, mended so many times it barely holds together. Your hands are always cracked. Your feet, unless it's winter, are bare, hair tied back, apron always dirty. And still, you get told to look presentable, to act modest, to carry yourself like a lady. You want to laugh when they say that. A lady? Out here? With dirt under your nails and mud up to your knees? Still, the same rules apply. Don't tempt. Don't speak out. Don't attract attention. Here's your historical fact. Most medieval peasants lived under a system of feudal obligation. You don't own your home or the land you work. It belongs to your lord. You owe him labour, and if you're lucky, protection in return. But if something goes wrong, like the crops failing, or a dispute over borders, your family pays the price. And as a girl, you're the first thing on the table to trade. If your family needs favour with a neighbour or wants to settle a debt, you may be promised in marriage without so much as a word of warning. You could go to bed thinking you're still a child, and wake up the next morning engaged to a man you've never spoken to. And if your family's very poor, you might not be married at all. You might be taken instead, by a merchant passing through, a drunken soldier, a farmhand who thinks you owe him something because he once shared a piece of bread. And no one will stop it, because girls like you don't have protection. And even if you survive it, the shame lands on your shoulders. You start to understand early that your body is both your burden and your trap. If you're pretty, you're watched. If you're plain, you're passed over. If you work too hard, you're unladylike. If you don't work enough, you're lazy. There is no version of you that anyone will ever call enough. And here's the cruel twist. You are expected to keep the entire household running. The cooking, the child rearing, the cleaning, the tending to sick relatives, the fetching of water and firewood. You do it all. And still, if your husband beats you, people say you must have failed him in some way. If your child dies, you must have angered God. If your food isn't enough, your hands must be lazy. The burden never shifts, not even for a moment. Now for your quirky historical tidbit. In some rural regions, midwives and herbalists were also peasant women who held vast knowledge of healing passed down through generations. But because they didn't write it down, couldn't write it down, no one gave them credit. In fact, that same knowledge could get them accused of sorcery. So while a noble woman might sip a tea for cramps and call it refined, if you brewed the same herbs, witchcraft. And the hypocrisy doesn't end there. On feast days, the men in the village drink too much and stumble through songs about wenches and tavern girls, all while insisting their wives stay pure and obedient. They laugh about visiting brothels during harvest festivals and slapping serving girls on the backside. But if a woman is caught being flirtatious, she's marked. If she's caught being unfaithful, she's punished, sometimes publicly, sometimes brutally. The double standard could not be more obvious, but no one says a word. Because you can't change rules you were never invited to write. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether peasant women had more freedom than their noble counterparts. After all, they weren't stuck in castles, weren't bound by court etiquette. But the truth? Freedom without protection isn't freedom, it's exposure. Peasant girls had to survive the elements and the men and the hunger and the expectations. Every day was a test, and every test came with a consequence. But despite everything, there are moments of joy. When you're laughing in the fields with the other girls, when someone starts a song and everyone joins in, when you share a secret, something silly, something beautiful, and it's yours, just for a moment. When you lie in the grass and look up at the sky and forget that your hands are blistered and your future already decided. Those moments are fleeting, but they matter. You live for them. Sometimes you dream. Not of palaces or princes, that's fairy tale nonsense, but of a quiet place. A cottage where no one watches you. A life where your children are safe, and your husband, if you must have one, sees you as something more than a tool. You dream of owning something, land maybe, or time, or simply your own body, a radical thought. You don't speak these dreams aloud, but they stay with you, like seeds in the soil, waiting. She moves through the village like smoke, like story, like something half forgotten and half feared. You know her before you ever speak to her. Everyone does. She's the midwife, the healer, the one women go to in the night with swollen bellies and trembling hands, the one who knows what root to boil, what word to whisper, what danger to avoid. She isn't just one woman, she's dozens, hundreds. passed from generation to generation. In every town, every village, every corner of medieval life, there is always someone like her. And for girls like you, she's both salvation and scandal. When your first blood came, it was her herbs that eased the pain. When your cousin miscarried in the woods and nearly bled to death, it was the midwife who kept her breathing. And when you whispered questions no one else would answer, questions about what happens during childbirth, about how long labour lasts, about what to do if you simply don't want a child yet, it was her door you knocked on, heart hammering in your chest. She didn't scold, she didn't ask for confessions. She gave you knowledge the church never would, handed down like secret songs. This for bleeding, this for swelling, this to ease the womb after labour, and sometimes, only when the door was bolted and the windows drawn, she gave you the other recipes, the forbidden ones, mugwort, rue, pennyroyal, for bringing on your cycle, for clearing the body. Always said softly, always never said directly. Because to speak too plainly would be dangerous. Here's your historical fact. Midwives were among the most essential and most mistrusted women in medieval communities. They had access to birth, to death, to blood and bone and breath. They dealt with the mysteries of life in a world where mysteries were the domain of men in robes and crosses. The church tolerated midwives because they were necessary, but they were never celebrated, always watched, often accused. Some were formally licensed, especially in cities where regulations tightened, but most worked through reputation alone, passed down skills, whispered advice, and personal experience. They weren't just delivering babies. They were helping women survive a system designed to bleed them dry, and that made them dangerous. Midwives were one of the few female roles with real authority. When a woman went into labour, she didn't call the priest, she called the midwife. And in that darkened room, beneath the pain and the prayers, the midwife took charge. She told the husband to wait outside. She told the mother-in-law to hush. She rolled up her sleeves and stepped into the storm. And whether the baby cried or not, whether the mother lived or died, the midwife was there. No man could claim that. But as with all things tied to women's knowledge, it came with risk. If too many babies died under a midwife's care, suspicion grew. If a woman bled out or caught fever, people whispered. If a midwife was too good, too confident, too mysterious, the whispers turned to accusations. And here's your quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, it was believed that midwives could be witches because they knew how to ease pain during childbirth. That alone was seen as unholy. After all, the Bible said Eve's daughters were meant to suffer. Pain in childbirth was God's punishment. So if a woman didn't scream, didn't writhe, didn't pay, then clearly someone had tampered with God's plan. You remember one such story. A woman in the next village gave birth with barely a sound. Her child came quickly, cleanly. The midwife, an older woman with milk-white hair and sharp eyes, was praised for her skill, for a while, until the priest caught wind. He questioned her methods, wanted to know what herbs she used, what prayers she said. When she refused to answer, because her loyalty was to the women, not the pulpit, she was dragged before the town elders, accused of sorcery. A full inquiry followed. No one ever saw her again. You ask your own midwife about her once. She gives you a long look, then tells you to never mention that woman's name again. Then she teaches you how to tie rosemary under your bed to keep nightmares away. Life, death, silence, all tied together. There's a scholarly debate about how much midwives actually knew about contraception and abortion. Some say they were experts, quietly helping women control their bodies with plants and timing. Others say their knowledge was patchy, more folk wisdom than science. But when you're desperate, science doesn't matter. What matters is someone listening, someone helping, someone telling you that you're not wicked for wanting to survive. And the midwife does that, even at risk to herself. Sometimes, late at night, when your husband is snoring and the fire has gone out, you think about the power she holds. Not in the way men hold power, loud and legal and wrapped in bloodied swords. Hers is quieter, beneath the skin, in the womb, in the eyes of the mothers she saves, in the soft prayers she mutters while washing away blood with lavender water. You begin to wonder what it would feel like to be that kind of woman. To know things, to be feared, yes, but also respected, needed. What would it mean to understand your body not as a shameful thing, but as a sacred one? To help other women navigate the same labyrinth you've been stumbling through your entire life. You think about asking the midwife to teach you, Just once you get up the courage. You start to say the words, but she stops you with a look. A sad one. "You're too young," she says, "and they're watching." You understand. It's always the same answer. But still, you tuck her lessons into your memory. You remember the names of the plants. You practice how to feel for a baby's position. You learn to recognize the signs of blood loss, of infection, of fear. You write nothing down. But your body remembers. Your mind becomes a map. Because maybe one day she'll be gone. Maybe they'll come for her, and someone will need to carry it on. And maybe, just maybe, that someone will be you. There are laws in your village, and then there are customs, the rules that live outside of ink and parchment, but somehow carry even more weight. You learn them early, not from books, but from the way your mother's voice tightens when certain names are mentioned, from the warning looks women exchange when someone steps out of the line. These are the laws that live in firelight and gossip, that whisper. This is what happens to girls like that. And if you're ever accused, truly accused of something serious, something sinful like adultery, lust, fornication, or just existing in a way that made the wrong man feel something, you may find yourself dragged into something far worse than judgment. They call it a trial by ordeal. Sounds dramatic, and it is. Because apparently when words aren't enough to prove your guilt or innocence, they turn to God's judgment. In other words, pain. Pain will tell the truth. Pain will decide whether you're lying, not your tears, not your word, certainly not the facts. So when the rumours begin, let's say someone claims they saw you sneaking out of the woods with a boy, or that your belly looks a bit too round, or that your husband is suspicious about your confessions, there's a chance it could escalate. A priest might be called, elders consulted, and then, one day, the knock comes. You're not invited, you're summoned. Here's your historical fact. Trial by ordeal was a legal practice in medieval Europe, used when evidence was lacking and the court wanted divine intervention. One of the most common for women accused of sexual sins was the boiling water ordeal. Your task? Plunge your hand into a cauldron of scalding water and retrieve a stone from the bottom. Then, your hand would be wrapped and sealed for 3 days. If it showed signs of healing, clean, not festering, you were declared innocent. If it blistered, rotted, or became infected, guilty, punishable by public penance, flogging, imprisonment, or worse. So let's go back to you, standing in the centre of the village square, a crowd gathering. They're not angry, not yet, just curious, hungry in that way people get when scandal is on the air. You see your neighbour, the one who smiled at you just yesterday, your cousin, even the blacksmith's son who once pulled your braid when you were 10. No one steps forward. No one says, she's kind. No one says, she's innocent. That isn't how this works. The priest blesses the water. It's boiling so fiercely the surface looks alive. You're shaking, and not just from fear. You haven't slept in days, you haven't eaten. Your body is already half broken from worry. And then they call your name. You kneel, you reach in. The pain is instant, biting, white hot. You feel the skin on your wrist split, the nerves scream. But you force your hand deeper, fingers scrabbling through the rolling heat, until you find the smooth, cruel shape of the stone. You grip it, you pull it free, and you pass out before they even wrap the cloth. You wake later in a dark room, the scent of damp wool and old blood in your nose. A woman sits beside you, one of the elder wives chosen to oversee your bandages. She's silent, expression unreadable. She unwraps your hand slowly. The skin is raw, blistered, already starting to stink. You know what that means, so you have failed. You're guilty now. Officially, divinely. It doesn't matter if you never touched the boy they claimed. It doesn't matter if your husband beat the accusation out of you. It doesn't matter if the entire thing was invented by a bitter rival who thought your eyes lingered too long on the wrong man. None of it matters. The priest says God has spoken. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some trials involved other tests, like carrying red-hot iron, or being bound and tossed into a river. The idea was that if you floated, you were guilty, because water rejected your sinful body. If you sank, you were innocent, but hopefully someone pulled you out in time. In other words, survive and you're damned. Die, and you were probably fine. Some scholars argue that these trials weren't always intended to produce a fair outcome. Sometimes they were symbolic, a way for the community to enact public purification, a performance of order, of righteousness. You're not judged alone. You're judged as a proxy for all the discomfort, guilt and fear that people project onto female bodies. And now, back in the square, you stand before the crowd, your ruined hand still bandaged. They don't jeer. That would require emotion. What you get instead is worse. Disgust. Pity. Eyes that slide away. Conversations that end when you enter. You're no longer a girl or a wife or a daughter. You are a warning. The punishment depends on the place. Maybe you're beaten, whipped with birch branches while everyone watches. Maybe you're forced to kneel in the church and beg forgiveness for leading others into sin. Maybe they shave your head. Maybe they banish you. Maybe they make you wear a sign around your neck with a single word, fallen. And what does your husband do? That depends on how angry or relieved he is. He might keep you, bitterly, and use your guilt as a weapon for the rest of your life. Or he might send you away, replace you with someone younger, cleaner. After all, you've been marked. Your body is no longer sacred. The irony is unbearable. You, who gave your whole self to the rules, now condemned by them. There's no rebuilding your reputation, no court of appeals. The word forgiven is rarely granted to women in your position. Only endured, only survived. But here's the strangest part. After all this, after the fire and the silence and the shame, you feel something else beneath the layers of agony. Clarity. Because now they've shown you the truth. That it was never about justice, never about God. It was about fear, about keeping girls like you quiet. And if they've already destroyed your name, then what more can they take? So you wrap your ruined hand and you look up. And you begin to live not for their approval, but in spite of it. You're in love. And not in the safe, sanctioned, neatly arranged way they expect of you. Not with a man chosen by your father or approved by the priest or bartered over wine and gold at some dusty table. No, your love is the kind that doesn't come with a dowry or a priest's blessing. It's the kind whispered about with a hint of fear. The kind that blooms in hidden glances and stolen moments, behind barns or between rows of grapevines. It's the kind that's forbidden. Maybe it's a boy from the wrong class, a stable hand, a travelling minstrel, a merchant's apprentice. Maybe it's a girl you met while helping gather herbs near the stream, her laugh more soothing than any psalm. Or maybe it's a widow older than you, wiser, with a gaze that sees too much and yet makes you feel whole. Whoever it is, the one you love isn't yours to love. Not here, not now, not under this sky thick with judgment and ears that listen through walls. You never meant to fall, but it happened anyway, as quietly and powerfully as a tide. At first it was just conversation, then lingering, then something warmer, deeper, more terrifying. You begin to feel alive again, like you've been living in black and white and suddenly someone handed you colour. It's exhilarating, and it's dangerous. Because love like this in your world is heresy. Here's your historical fact. In medieval Europe, romantic love outside of marriage was not only discouraged, it could be prosecuted. Adultery was a legal offence, punishable by fines, beatings, or public shaming. Homosexual relationships were considered sodomy, a capital crime in many regions. Even writing or singing about unnatural love could land you in trouble. The church didn't just frown on forbidden love, it burned it. But even knowing all this, you still meet them, in secret places, behind the church after Vespers, in the dark corner of a field under the excuse of gathering wood. You hold hands like the world isn't ending around you. You share kisses that taste like rebellion. You write each other tiny notes on scraps of parchment or carved into the soft bark of trees. No one else would notice them, but you do. You live for those moments. The rest of your day, your entire life, becomes a string of burdens to carry until the next moment comes, until you can touch them again, until you can breathe again. But of course, secrets don't stay secret forever. People notice. Maybe it's a servant with wandering eyes. Maybe it's a brother who sees you slip out too often. Maybe it's just that your face glows a little too brightly when someone says their name. Suspicion blooms like mould, quiet, fast, poisonous. One day someone confronts you. Maybe it's your father, maybe a priest, maybe your husband. They don't have proof. They don't need it. They just know. And the fury in their voices isn't just about the act, it's about the defiance. The audacity of you thinking you deserved love, real love, chosen love. You're dragged before the local court, or worse, the church tribunal. There are no kind faces, no sympathy. just hard questions asked with sneers. They ask you to confess, to repent, to name the one who tempted you, who pulled you into this sin. They want your guilt in words. They want your shame in full display. You stay silent, or maybe you speak. It doesn't matter. They've already decided. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In some parts of France and Italy, medieval courts held love trials, especially when someone's inheritance or marriage was threatened by an affair. There were even documented cases of women being forced to parade through town in a donkey cart, labelled adulteresses, while being pelted with filth by children and strangers. Imagine having your deepest truth, the only thing that ever felt real, turned into street theatre for people to laugh at. And if your forbidden love was same-sex, it wasn't just scandalous, it was monstrous. The church declared it against nature, a perversion that warranted death. Men were burned for it. Women too, though their punishments were sometimes quieter, hidden beneath the veil of madness or lifelong imprisonment. The worst part, sometimes your lover would be spared and you alone punished, because women were always seen as the corruptors, even when they weren't. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how common same-sex relationships truly were among medieval women. Some argue they were far more frequent than records suggest, hidden beneath layers of euphemism and friendship. Others claim they were rare, repressed out of fear, but between the lines of court documents and poetry and secret letters, you see hints of what you felt: longing, intimacy, danger. So let's say the worst happens. You're caught. You're punished. Maybe not executed, but removed from your life. Married off quickly, as damage control, or sent to a convent where the walls press in and your prayers feel hollow. You try to forget their face, their voice, their hands. You try to bury it all beneath layers of obedience and numbness. But love like that doesn't die easily. Even years later, you'll find yourself walking through the market and smelling something that reminds you of them. Rosemary, or crushed mint, or fresh-baked rye. And your breath will catch. Your hands will shake. You'll look around, expecting to see them, knowing you won't. And maybe one night you find one of those tree trunks you used to carve messages into. The bark grown over now, but your fingers still know where to feel. You trace the letters with a fingertip. Just a name, just a memory, still burning. You've read the poems, you've heard the songs. They drift down from the castles like perfume, laced with yearning and danger, wrapped in silks and starlight. The minstrels call it courtly love, a love so pure it's painful, a passion so noble it must never be consummated. It's in the tales of knights who pledge themselves to fair ladies, of women who inspire great feats from behind veils and towers, of longing glances across torchlit halls. It's all very romantic, until you realise it's just another performance, and you, once again, are the prize and the prison. You see, courtly love isn't meant for girls like you. It's for noblemen to play pretend, for troubadours to impress their patrons, for bored husbands to flirt with other men's wives under the mask of chivalry. It's about the idea of you, not your voice or your mind or your choices. You're a symbol in their story, a figure to be worshipped from afar or written about in metaphor. And if you ever tried to claim that love in return, if you ever dared to act on it, you'd fall hard. Because the entire system is built on contradiction. The man may write verses comparing your eyes to stars, but he does not want you as an equal. He wants you as inspiration. And if you inspire too much, if his passion becomes a scandal, you are the one who takes the fall. You are the seductress, the temptress, the reason he strayed, the root of his ruin. Here's your historical fact. Finamore, or refined love, was a literary tradition that flourished among the European nobility from the 12th century onward. It created the blueprint for modern romance: love at first sight, star-crossed fate, burning passion restrained by honour. But in practice, it was deeply one-sided. Men got to be passionate, poetic, and brave. Women got to be silent, virtuous, and unobtainable. And the strange part is, some women adored this system. They found power in being adored, in wielding soft influence over powerful men, in using their beauty and status to draw out confessions and loyalty. And for a brief moment it might have felt like control, but it was fragile. The moment they stepped outside the script, by expressing desire, by asserting autonomy, the illusion shattered. You've seen it happen. A lady of the court whose knight went too far, who tried to take what he believed he'd earned with his ballads and flattery. She screamed, fought back, and suddenly she was no longer the muse. She was hysterical, cruel, maybe even a liar. He was forgiven. She was exiled. Or maybe it's the girl who did fall in love, who answered the poems with letters of her own, who risked everything for a few nights of actual flesh and blood connection. It was romantic until it was discovered. And then she was disgraced. Pregnant, perhaps, or married off to someone else in shame. Love in this world is fine as fantasy, but reality is punishment. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some troubadours composed albus, or dawn songs, which mourned the coming of morning because it meant lovers had to part. Beautiful, yes. Poetic, certainly. But also revealing. These were songs written by men about the heartbreak of having to sneak away from someone else's wife. Songs that painted the woman as goddess and siren, yet erased her risk entirely. The man walks away in sorrow. The woman stays behind to bear the consequences. And what of the girls who couldn't read these poems, who didn't understand the rules of the game? The peasant girl who mistook a nobleman's verses for genuine intent, who gave her heart, and perhaps her body, to a man who only wanted a few lines for his next song. She is the one left behind. Not in a poem, in real life, with a bruised heart, or a child, or a ruined name. There's an open scholarly debate about whether courtly love ever reflected genuine emotions, or if it was always just literary pageantry. The truth probably lives somewhere in between, because people did fall in love, even in castles, even behind all the rules. But love doesn't thrive when one person has all the freedom and the other all the consequences. You learn to watch the poets with wary eyes. Their words are beautiful, yes, but they float, they drift, they never land. And if they do, if a poem about your smile lands on the wrong ears, it could be the start of your undoing. So you smile when you're supposed to. You let your eyes flutter just so. You let them think you believe in it, the romance, the longing, the dance of desire restrained. But inside, you know better. You've seen too many girls swallowed by those verses. And still, you sometimes wonder what it would feel like to be loved not as a metaphor but as a person. To be seen, not as an ideal or a virtue, but as a living, breathing, complicated soul. What if someone loved your laugh, not your silence, your messy thoughts, not your restraint? What if love didn't have to be tragic to be real? But this world doesn't allow that kind of love. Not yet. So you keep your heart guarded. You keep your gaze low. You read the poems, memorize the verses, nod at the flattery. But you do not fall for it. Because falling, in your case, is never just emotional. It's catastrophic. The convent isn't what you expected. Maybe you thought it would be all quiet prayers, candlelight and cloisters echoing with choral music. Maybe you thought it would feel like safety, or a prison, or maybe both. What you didn't expect was how ordinary it feels after the initial shock wears off. How the walls smell like baking bread in the morning and damp stone at night. How the silence isn't oppressive but purposeful, intentional, like a woven blanket that covers something you didn't know needed hiding. You arrive because you're sent. Almost no girl chooses the convent freely. It's your family's decision, not yours. Maybe you're the second daughter with no dowry. Maybe there was a scandal, real or rumoured, and this is the only way to salvage the family's name. Maybe your father made a vow when your mother was ill and now he's keeping it, in the form of your body and future. Or maybe it's punishment, a life sentence wrapped in holy words. The nuns are not cruel, at least not most of them. They teach you the rules, when to rise, when to eat, when to chant the hours. You are given robes, plain and scratchy, and a veil that marks you as a novice. Your hair is cut. You're taught how to fold your hands and your thoughts. You're reminded constantly that obedience is a virtue. But then, slowly, something else begins to unfold. Here's your historical fact. Medieval convents, especially in wealthier or urban regions, were more than just religious houses. They were also centres of learning, healing, and autonomy. Many nuns were literate. Some copied manuscripts, ran hospitals, or managed land and property. In some cases, abbesses wielded more power than many men. The convent could be paradoxically a place of restriction and freedom. You begin to notice it in little things. A senior sister corrects a visiting priest with cool precision, and no one questions her. Another nun grey-haired and sharp-eyed, oversees the finances for the entire priory. A young novice slips you a scroll of poetry, Latin, beautifully written, probably her own. There is knowledge here, quiet, guarded, but alive. And for the first time in your life, no one is measuring your worth by your womb. You aren't being prepared for marriage. You aren't being told to smile. You aren't being touched, judged, bargained over. Your body is your own, in a strange, cloistered way. You begin to sleep without fear. You walk the stone halls and feel your shoulders lower for the first time in years, and the sisters talk, not in open rebellion, but in the way women always talk when they are left alone long enough. They whisper about politics, about theology, about the rumours from Rome or Avignon. One has opinions about war, another reads medical texts, another spends her days cataloguing herbs and remedies in a neat calligraphic hand. And here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some medieval nuns wrote letters so powerful, so biting, they were passed between courts like scandalous novels. One famous abbess wrote love poetry, another corrected bishops, some even became saints, not because they were submissive, but because they were relentless in their demands for justice. And while men often mocked a nun chatter, they were also clearly rattled by it. What power a woman must have to command silence and speech. Still, it's not utopia. The rules are strict. The abbot who oversees the priory is not always kind. If you step too far out of line, there are punishments. Silence, extra fasting, hard labour. And some of the sisters are not saints. Petty rivalries exist. Pride creeps in. There's a kind of hierarchy even here. But for the most part it is different. The cruelty, when it appears, is human, not holy. And then there's the question of belief. Some girls who arrive here find God. They take comfort in the rituals, the chants, the rhythm of the hours. Others pretend. They mumble the prayers and go through the motions, feeling nothing. And some, like you, exist in a strange in-between. You don't know if you believe, but you believe in the peace. You believe in the space this place gives you to think, to be still, to not be afraid. That, in itself, feels sacred. There's an open scholarly debate about how much autonomy women truly had in convents. Some say they were still heavily controlled by male clergy, their choices limited, their voices filtered. Others argue that these were the first spaces where women could read, write, govern, and speak without interruption. That this was the seed of something powerful. You see glimpses of it, in the way the abbess doesn't flinch when confronting a bishop, in the secret library hidden behind the chapel, where banned texts are locked away but still read. In the conversations at dusk, when the world outside the walls fades and it's just you and the women, speaking freely under the soft wash of twilight, you begin to learn, really learn for the first time, about the stars, about the body, about language, about history. The more you know, the more you realise how much has been kept from you, how much of the world has been edited and redacted before it ever reached your ears. You begin to write too, secretly, in a scrapbook hidden beneath your mattress. Not poetry at first, just thoughts, questions, fragments, then letters to yourself, then stories, and maybe one day, something bolder, a record, a memory, a small handwritten truth in a world full of falsehoods. You know you won't stay here forever. The decision may not even be yours. A wealthy man might want a pious wife. A family debt might need settling. Your presence might become inconvenient. But while you are here, you are more than a body. You are a mind. And that, you realise, is the most forbidden thing of all. Not your lust, not your love, not your silence, your thoughts. There's a heaviness that sinks into your skin by the time you reach womanhood. It isn't just the weight of work or expectation. It's the creeping, unspoken truth that your body is a battlefield. Not in the glorious way of warriors, but in the quiet, suffocating way of sin. You're told this early and often, your body is not yours. It is dangerous. It is weak. It is temptation. And every inch of it, your hair, your hips, your voice, your breath, is a risk to your soul and everyone else's. The church makes this clear at every opportunity. You are Eve, after all, the one who fell first, the one who tempted, the one who couldn't obey, and so you carry the punishment, you bear the shame, you inherit the curse of bleeding and birthing and bending. You're taught to believe this is justice, that pain is sacred, that suffering is your birthright. You sit through sermons that pound this idea home. Lust is a sin, pleasure is a sin, Desire is a sin, and it doesn't matter if you wanted it or not. If you cause desire in others, that's on you too. Your existence is enough to lead men astray. So cover your hair, lower your eyes, don't laugh too loudly, don't sway when you walk, don't be soft, don't be hard, don't be at all. Here's your historical fact. Medieval theologians like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively on sexuality, and nearly all of it framed women as morally and spiritually inferior. The body, they said, was a trap, and women were the bait. Even marital sex, while permitted, was discouraged if it involved too much pleasure. The ideal woman was obedient, modest, and if possible virginal forever. And that's the most twisted part. They don't actually want you to enjoy anything. You're allowed to marry. You're expected to bear children, but don't like it. Don't take pleasure. That would be indulgent. Unholy. Even within marriage, a woman's desire was suspicious. Dangerous. If you ever said out loud that you wanted intimacy, or worse, if you were curious or confident, you could be accused of being unnatural, or worse, demonic. So you learn to fake ignorance. You learn to feign disinterest. You learn to let things happen to you instead of seeking them out. Because curiosity could cost you everything. Your mother never explained these things, not directly. She simply taught you how to avoid trouble, how to tuck your shift just so, how to move without drawing eyes, how to clean yourself quietly, modestly, as if even bathing should be done with shame. When your body began to change, she looked away, handed you rags, whispered prayers. She never said, "This is normal," she said, "This is your burden." And when your first husband came to you on your wedding night, it was not with gentleness. It was not even with cruelty. It was with duty, like he was fulfilling a chore. And you were expected to receive him with grace, like a good wife. You bit your tongue. You thought of saints. You tried to disappear inside yourself. And afterward the women clucked and nodded when they saw the stained sheet. "Good girl," they said. "It's done now." As if it were some task you'd completed well. As if it mattered how you felt. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Medieval penitentials, manuals used by priests to assign punishments, contained a laundry list of sexual sins, many specifically aimed at women. A woman who initiated sex, for example, might be told to fast on bread and water for years. Women who were too eager could be whipped. Some books even listed specific positions as sinful, and only missionary was allowed, for the sole purpose of procreation. Anything else? Lust, mortal sin, hellfire. So where exactly does that leave you? You want to believe that love and pleasure are not the same as sin, that your body is not a curse, that you were not born broken, but every story, every lesson, every law insists otherwise. Even the saints you're told to admire, especially the women, are famous for refusing the body. The best thing a woman can do, apparently, is die before she ever experiences desire. You hear their names again and again. St. Agnes, who chose death rather than marriage. St. Cecilia, who preserved her virginity even in marriage. St. Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon but emerged still pure. They aren't role models, they're warnings. Be untouched, or be nothing. There's a debate among scholars about how much of this doctrine was actually enforced. Sure, the church taught these things, but did women really believe them? Some did. Some internalized the guilt so deeply it became instinct. Others nodded, then quietly defied the rules in whatever way they could. A flirtation, a stolen kiss, a whispered confession to a midwife, a glance across the pews. Rebellion didn't always come in fire, it came in shadows. And you? You walk the line between survival and silence. You long to be seen as more than a vessel or a vice. You want to believe your body can be yours, that you can feel things, hunger, pleasure, love, and still be whole, still be good. But that kind of thinking is dangerous. It makes you reckless. It makes you honest. So instead, you nod through the sermons. You kneel during confession. You fast even when your stomach knots in hunger. You pray for forgiveness for things you didn't choose, didn't want, didn't even understand. But sometimes, late at night, you trace the outline of your own hands. You feel the softness of your own skin. You look at yourself in the reflection of a bowl of water and think, this body has carried me. This body has never lied to me. Others have. And for a breath you let go of the shame. You hold that small act of defiance like a candle in a dark room. Fragile, flickering, sacred. Because the truth is, your body is not a sin. It's a story. And no one, not a priest, not a husband, not a doctrine, has the right to write it without you. You're unmarried. That's it. That's your crime. Not unkind, not dishonest, not cruel or lazy or impure, just unmarried. And suddenly, it's like you're walking around with a glowing mark on your forehead that reads suspicious. Maybe you're 25, maybe 30, maybe older. But whatever your age, people have noticed, and they don't like it. At first it's subtle, the tilted heads, the gentle inquiries. Still not married? Any suitors? Have you considered the abbey? Then the jokes begin, nervous laughter about old maids and how you must be picky. Then come the silences, the sudden change in conversation when you walk into a room, the way mothers nudge their daughters away from you as if spinsterhood might be contagious. You start to feel it in every part of your daily life. The priest's gaze lingers a second too long when you come for Mass. The baker cuts your bread a little thinner. The children whisper as you pass, even though you once rocked half of them to sleep when their mothers were busy. You become other, and not in the elegant, mysterious way poetry suggests. In the unnerving, what's wrong with her way that makes you a walking question mark. Because in their eyes, if you're not claimed by a man, then what are you? What are you good for? A woman's worth, they say, is in being a wife, a mother, a vessel. And if you're none of those things, then maybe you're something else entirely. Maybe you're dangerous. Here's your historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, unmarried women past a certain age were viewed with suspicion, especially if they lived alone or had no male guardian. Some towns kept lists of spinsters and widows, partly for taxation, but also for surveillance. It wasn't just about morality, it was about control. A woman who didn't belong to a man didn't fit the system, and what doesn't fit often gets feared. You begin to notice that other women like you don't last long. Some vanish into convents, others are married off hastily to older widowers in neighbouring villages. A few stay, quiet, obedient, invisible. But the ones who speak up, the ones who read too much or ask too many questions or take too much pride in their independence, they start getting called things. Cold, bitter, loose, prideful, witch. You start noticing the pattern. The older women with gardens just a little too successful. The ones with cats. The ones who sell herbal salves or speak about the moon. The ones who don't bend their heads quite fast enough during prayer. When illness comes to the village, or a crop fails, it's not long before someone's pointing fingers. And who's the easiest target? A woman who doesn't have a man to defend her. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In 14th and 15th century Europe, some single women were legally banned from owning certain items, like distilling equipment, books of spells, or even mirrors. Why? Because these were considered tools of vanity and sorcery. So if you had too many candles in your home, or too many herbs, or just too much knowledge, that was enough. You didn't need a black hat or broomstick, just your unmarried status and a little too much competence. And if you're widowed without sons, you're in even more danger. Your husband's family might try to claim your property, accusing you of stealing land. If your husband died suddenly, there's a whisper that you poisoned him. If your husband drank himself to death, you must have driven him to it. You're not just alone, you're suspect. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether women in this position ever truly had more freedom, or if that was just a romanticised myth. Some historians argue that single women could run businesses, own land, and live more freely than married women. Others say that the price of that freedom was constant surveillance, social isolation, and vulnerability to slander and violence.
You feel the truth of both sides. Because yes, when no one owns you, you can make your own choices. You can rise when you like, walk alone, tend your own garden, keep the money you earn. And for a while, that feels like a kind of victory. But you are always aware that eyes are on you, that the world is waiting for you to trip, that your solitude is seen not as strength, but as proof that something must be wrong with you. And still, part of you treasures it. The silence in the morning, the ability to read or think without interruption, the dignity of not being someone's property. You don't have to serve, you don't have to suffer at someone else's whim. You can live uneasily, quietly, but on your own terms, until the wrong person gets sick, or a storm ruins a harvest, or a child dies. And then the villagers look for an explanation that feels comforting, and there you are, alone, Woman, unclaimed, guilty. They knock on your door with questions disguised as prayers. They ask where you go at night, what you put in your stew, why your cat watches them with such human eyes. They don't say the word, not yet, but you can feel it rising like smoke in their throats. Witch. You go to mass more often, you light extra candles, you keep your gaze low and your steps light, but none of it helps. Because once they've decided that something about you is off, the only way to fix it is confession or punishment. And here's the worst part. Part of you does feel guilty, not because you've sinned, but because you've survived outside their rules. Because deep down, you know that living this way, unmarried, unafraid, is a kind of heresy, a quiet rebellion. And rebellions, even silent ones, rarely end kindly. So you wake each day and wonder, is today the day someone points the finger? And if they do, will anyone speak for you? Or will your silence, your freedom, your unclaimed life be used as proof that they were right all along? You never really thought about pants until you were told not to wear them. It wasn't a garment you were pining for, just something that made sense. Something practical, warm, less likely to catch on a thorn or ride up in the rain. But the moment you imagine pulling a pair on, tying them at the waist like a man, something shifts. It's not just clothing anymore, it's power, it's freedom, and it's completely forbidden. In the world you live in, what you wear is not just fashion, it's morality. Your clothes tell everyone exactly where you belong, your class, your role, your virtue. Women in skirts, men in trousers, anything else, and you're not just strange, you're a threat. They'll say you're pretending, they'll say you're unnatural, they'll say you want to be a man, as if there's no in-between, no room for simple logic or comfort. It's all black and white, and you're somewhere in the messy middle. Still, you're tempted. You hear about a girl who dressed as a boy to travel safely, another who fought in battle, her long hair hidden beneath a steel helmet. You hear whispers of women who disguise themselves to enter universities, to read and learn and move in spaces not meant for them. Most were caught, some were punished. One or two disappeared completely, into legend or into the crowd. You wonder if it's courage or desperation that pushes them that far. Maybe both. Here's your historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, laws specifically banned women from wearing men's clothing. The term for it was cross-dressing, and it wasn't just frowned upon. It was illegal under both secular and church law. Women caught wearing pants or men's tunics could be fined, flogged, excommunicated, or worse. The reasoning: it blurred the God-given distinctions between male and female, and that, apparently, was a sin that shook the very foundations of the world. The Bible was even brought into it, Deuteronomy 22:5, if anyone's keeping score. A woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, it reads. And just like that, your wool trousers become the gateway to eternal damnation. But the rules weren't just about faith. They were about control. Clothes were a system of classification, just like everything else. Noble women wore silks and structured bodices. Peasant girls wore coarse linen and rough wool. Prostitutes were sometimes forced to wear stripes or bells. Widows wore black. Virgins wore white. There was no space in that system for flexibility, no space for ambiguity. If your appearance made people uncomfortable, then clearly you were the problem. And yet, some still did it. Some still dared. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Joan of Arc, perhaps the most famous medieval cross-dresser, wore men's clothing and armor as she led French forces into battle during the 100 Years' War. Even after being captured and imprisoned, she refused to take off her trousers and return to women's clothing, partly for protection, partly as a statement. And in the end, it was part of what got her killed. She was burned at the stake in 1431, not just as a heretic, but as a woman who refused to dress like a woman. There's a kind of grim admiration in that. She defied every expectation. She wore what made sense for her mission, for her safety, for her life, and they couldn't handle it. They feared what she represented, not just a woman in pants, but a woman outside the script, a woman who could not be boxed in, covered up, or silenced. And now, centuries later, here you are, tying your skirts tighter, feeling the familiar pull of cloth against your legs, wondering what would happen if you stepped out of line, literally. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? Would the world collapse if you walked across the village square wearing something pertaining to a man? Probably not. But someone would make sure you collapsed for it. Because the fear isn't about trousers, it's about autonomy. There's a scholarly debate about how common cross-dressing really was in the medieval period. Some argue it was rare, exceptional, something that only happened in times of crisis. Others suggest it may have been more widespread, especially among women who traveled, escaped abuse, or sought to work in male-only trades. But like so many things tied to women's agency, it was hidden, erased, or punished into silence. You start to wonder about the girl down the road who never married and always seemed to disappear during planting season, or the young scribe at the abbey whose voice seemed just a little too high, or the tailor's apprentice with the soft features and nervous smile. Maybe they were just people, or maybe they were living between lines that no one dared to read aloud. And what about you? Maybe you don't want to fight wars or flee across kingdoms. Maybe you just want to walk through the woods without tripping over a skirt. Maybe you want to climb a tree without flashing half the village. Maybe you want to feel warm in winter without wrapping yourself like a corpse. Maybe you want to choose what covers your body. But in this world, a girl in trousers is no longer just a girl. She's a scandal, a deviant, a threat. So you keep the thought to yourself. You press it flat like a folded tunic beneath your bed. You let it live in daydreams and late-night whispers. You imagine slipping on a pair of breeches just once and walking into the sunrise without apology. Because even the smallest rebellion, a stitch, a hem, a silhouette, can be a revolution. And you are not afraid of revolutions. Not anymore. There are stories that don't make it into the sermons. They don't get carved into church walls or painted into stained glass. They're not preserved in scrolls by monks with tidy Latin scripts. But they're real, passed from girl to girl, whispered at wells, retold by firelight with a glint of daring in the voice. Stories of outlaws, of rebels, of women who didn't ask permission to love and didn't apologize when they were caught. You cling to those stories like secret scripture, because sometimes, late at night, when everything feels too heavy, when your body is a cage and your choices feel pre-written, it's the thought of them that keeps your chest from caving in. You think of the girl who ran off with a traveling musician, her wedding dress still folded in a chest she never opened. They say she rides with his troupe now, disguised as a boy, playing tambourine and singing songs too scandalous for churches. They say she writes her own verses, that she dances barefoot on tavern tables, that she never once looked back, or the widow who took over her husband's apothecary after he died. Technically illegal, definitely frowned upon, but she kept doing it anyway, herbs, tinctures, treatments. Some said she was a witch. Others just said she was the only one who ever cured their cough. She didn't flinch when they called her names. She just kept grinding her powders, lips set in a thin smile, like she'd already heard worse. And then there are the real legends, the ones even the monks can't quite erase. Here's your historical fact. There were women throughout medieval Europe who defied the laws of love and marriage. Some ran away from arranged unions. Some lived with lovers openly, in defiance of church law. Some joined outlaw bands, living in forests or mountains, free from the rules that ruled the rest of the world. While most were eventually caught, punished, or forgotten, a few became icons, symbols of female resistance before anyone had the language to call it that. One such figure is known only from the margins of chronicles. She dressed as a man and fought alongside rebels during a local uprising. When she was finally captured, the court reportedly couldn't decide which crime to punish her for first: rebellion, impersonation, or sleeping with a woman. In the end, she escaped the gallows, disappeared. Some say she made it to Italy, others say she drowned. Either way, she slipped through their fingers, and that, in itself, was a kind of victory. You learn these stories in pieces, like broken relics buried in dirt, a phrase muttered by an old aunt, a tavern song about a girl who rode faster than the law, a carved heart on a tree no one admits to owning. And every time it makes something inside you stand a little straighter. It reminds you that love doesn't always have to be a cage. That choice isn't just a dream. That rebellion can be quiet, or joyful, or kissed into your collarbone by someone who sees you, really sees you, for the first time. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In some court records from the 14th and 15th centuries, judges encountered what they called irregular unions, lovers who refused to marry but lived together anyway. One German town even recorded multiple cases of couples who had been married by affection, not ceremony. Of course, the church cracked down on this, but the records exist, like proof that love didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it didn't even try. There's a debate among historians about whether these rule breakers were rare exceptions or the tip of a quiet, widespread resistance. Were most people truly obedient to the church's strict views on love and marriage? Or were they simply careful, hiding their real lives behind closed shutters and whispered confessions? The documents only show what was caught. But what about all that was not? You begin to wonder what your life could look like if you followed your own script. No arranged marriage, no forced silence, just choice. Would you live with someone you chose, regardless of approval? Would you make a family out of love, not duty? Would you travel, take a name that wasn't yours, make a home with someone who touched your soul? You know it wouldn't be easy. The punishments are real. Adulteresses can be whipped or branded, runaways jailed, lovers separated and publicly shamed. But sometimes, you think the punishment of staying silent is worse, of marrying someone who doesn't love you, of smiling at the altar while your heart sobs in some locked room of your ribs. And so, you start small. A question, asked when no one is listening. A secret meeting under moonlight. A letter passed in a market, folded into a coin purse. You learn the paths through the woods that don't leave footprints. You keep your secrets not because they're shameful, but because they're yours. One night, you hear a song drifting from the edge of the village, a melody you don't recognize. It's a woman's voice, strong, steady, unafraid. You follow it and find her sitting by the fire, surrounded by strangers. She's wearing trousers, her hair's short. There's a scar on her cheek and laughter in her eyes. She sees you watching. She nods, just once. You feel something shift. Maybe you don't run away that night. Maybe you don't take a lover or change your name or start a revolution. But you begin to believe that you could. And that belief, that flicker of what if, it's the beginning of freedom. Because love isn't just what they tell you it is, obedient, controlled, signed off by fathers and priests. Love is messy, wild, beautiful, sometimes reckless, sometimes patient, sometimes so quiet it can only live in a heartbeat shared under stolen stars. And in the darkest corners of a world that tried to make you small, that kind of love is the loudest rebellion of all. You'd think by now the rules would fade, that centuries-old chains would rust and fall away. But as the world shifts into new shapes, you start to notice something unsettling. Some of the medieval rules you thought were left behind, they're still here, just dressed differently. Less iron and parchment, more policy and subtext. Same control, same fear. You're walking through a modern street now, in a modern body, but there's still that voice, that ancient heavy voice, whispering that your worth is in your purity, that your body is suspicious, that your desire must be monitored, contained, regulated. It's just been updated for a new era. Instead of priests and inquisitors, there are politicians, pundits, school boards, algorithms. They don't burn you now, not literally, but they dissect you, shame you, make laws about you without asking a single question to you. You scroll through your phone and see girls in uniforms getting sent home for distracting clothing. You see women shamed in courtrooms for how they dress, who they sleep with, what they post. You hear debates over whether someone deserved what happened to them. Over and over again, it's the same refrain dressed in different robes. Your body is not yours. And suddenly, the threads between the past and present are hard to ignore. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval laws about women's sexuality, particularly around virginity, adultery, and marital control, echo in modern legislation around reproductive rights, dress codes, consent laws, and social expectations. The same systems that once told women their bodies belonged to their fathers or husbands are still at play, just framed with morality, protection, or tradition. The architecture remains. We've just slapped new paint on the stone. You realize that the virginity tests of medieval times, the ones involving bed sheets or invasive physical exams, aren't so distant. They show up in different forms now. Some families in certain parts of the world still demand proof. Some clinics still conduct so-called tests, even when science has debunked them as meaningless. Some schools still measure a girl's skirt before teaching her to measure her own worth. And purity culture? Alive and well. It's sold in bracelets, sermons, youth group retreats, and graduation speeches. You've heard the same words you read in dusty manuscripts. Modesty, chastity, obedience. Only now with hashtags and soft lighting. As if repackaging oppression in pastels makes it less heavy. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In some medieval communities, women who broke sexual rules were punished by being paraded through town in bizarre, humiliating outfits, sometimes with phallic objects attached to their clothing or signs hung around their necks, listing their sins. In today's world, we just do it online. The stocks have been replaced with comment sections. The shame parade now comes with filters and trending tags. There's a scholarly debate about whether the persistence of these ideas stems from religion, economics, or pure human anxiety about female agency. But in practice, it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. Women are taught that their bodies are problems to be solved, not homes to be honored. And yet, you are still here. We are still here. The legacy of those medieval girls who were silenced, punished, forgotten, it didn't die with them. It got passed down in fragments, in rebellion, in the quiet things, songs, stories, recipes, spells, wisdom hidden in plain sight, in the grandmother who tells her granddaughter to trust her gut, in the friend who walks you home, in the teacher who slips you a banned book, in the protest signs and the whispered secrets and the hands held tightly in defiance. You are standing in the long shadow of 1,000 stolen voices, but you're not voiceless. You are the proof that they didn't erase everything. You're the reason the rules don't hold like they used to. You wear what you want. You kiss who you choose. You ask questions. You write. You burn. You heal. You scream if you need to. And sure, the system pushes back. It always does. But every time you step outside the line, every time you claim space, every time you live boldly in a body they tried to shame, you're rewriting history. No more virginity tests, no more silent girls, no more chains disguised as ribbons. You are the daughter of rebels and witches, saints and sinners. You carry both their wounds and their wildness. And maybe you don't always feel brave. Maybe some days you still shrink. Still feel the old fears prickling like embroidery needles under your skin. But you remember them. The girls in convents, in corsets, in courtrooms. The ones who didn't get to finish their story. You are the echo of everything they weren't allowed to say. You are the answer to their prayers. You are the part they never saw coming. And you're not done yet. So here we are, at the edge of the story, where the echoes finally begin to soften, and the torch is gently passed to your hands. You've walked through centuries tonight, past stone chapels and damp dungeons, through silk-draped halls and muddy village paths. You've met girls born into cages carved by custom, by church, by fear. You've seen how desire, something so natural, was turned into a trap, and how even love could be wielded as punishment. And yet, you've also seen flickers of rebellion in unexpected corners. A girl who ran, a widow who healed, a nun who read, a woman who simply refused to break. This wasn't just history, it never is. It's scaffolding for the present, the bones beneath the skin of today. Those rules they made, the ones about your body, your voice, your love, they didn't vanish. But now, at least, you see them, and you know where they came from. And maybe that's where real power begins, not in tearing everything down all at once, but in noticing the bricks and choosing not to carry them. So wherever you are tonight, lying under blankets, eyes heavy, fan humming in the background. I hope you remember something simple. You are not made of sin. You are not born broken. Your body is not a threat. And your story? It's still yours to write. Now take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. You've made it through the darkest forests of history. There's nothing lurking under your bed. Only the quiet strength of all the women who came before you, and all the freedom waiting in your bones. Rest easy. You're home.